They locked her in the basement of the very house she had built with 40 years of sweat and tears, and called it a sensible arrangement. This is the story of that mother. And this is when she taught the world, you should never mistake silence for weakness. If you think you know the story, you're wrong. This isn't about a weak mother betrayed by her son. This is the story of a woman who was silent for too long, and one day she decided not to be silent anymore. And when she spoke, an empire crumbled. Watch until the end. Like and comment the city you're watching, so I know how far my story has come. Now, let's begin. I need to tell you something before I begin. I am not a dramatic woman. I never have been. I raised my son in a house where we didn't yell, didn't throw things, didn't make scenes at dinner tables or in parking lots. I believed in quiet dignity. I believed that if you lived with grace, grace would find its way back to you. I was wrong, and that wrongness cost me nearly everything. My name is Marion Hale. I'm 67 years old. I have arthritic fingers, a bad hip that flares up in cold weather, and a garden in the back of my house that I've been tending for 32 years. I know where every tulip bulb is buried. I know which corner of the yard floods after heavy rain. I know the exact sound the third step from the top makes when you step on its left edge, a low, hollow groan, like a complaint held too long. I know this house the way you know your own body, and I'm going to tell you about the night someone tried to take it from me. The trouble didn't announce itself. That's the thing about betrayal. It rarely does. It doesn't knock on the front door. It comes in through the side, quiet, wearing a familiar face. It sits down at your kitchen table and drinks your coffee and compliments your curtains while it's already counting your square footage. Adrian, my son, had been visiting more frequently over the previous year. At first I was glad for it. He and his wife Lila had been so busy, always busy, and the visits had grown sparse after his father's health declined. So when they started coming every other weekend, I thought something had shifted in him. I thought maybe he was trying to reconnect. Maybe he'd looked at his father sitting in that recliner with his oxygen tank beside him and finally understood that time doesn't wait. I told myself that because I wanted it to be true. I made casseroles. I changed the guest room sheets. I kept his favorite brand of coffee, a dark roast from a specialty shop 20 minutes away, stocked in my pantry. I did all the things mothers do when they're hoping. Lila was always polite in the way that people are polite when they're performing it. She would compliment my cooking with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd ask about Victor's health with the tone of someone inquiring about a car that had been in the shop too long. Not concern exactly. More like an ongoing assessment of a situation she was monitoring. I noticed. I'm not oblivious. I just chose to interpret it generously. That's what I do. I've been doing it my entire life. Victor, my husband of 41 years, noticed too. But Victor, by that point, had very little energy left for conflict. The emphysema had hollowed him out slowly, quietly, the way water wears down stone. He would watch Lila from his recliner with those careful brown eyes of his, and sometimes, when they'd leave, he'd look at me and say very softly, "She's measuring the rooms, Marion." I told him he was being paranoid. I was the one who was wrong. Okay. It happened on a Thursday evening in October. The light was going fast the way it does in autumn. 1 minute amber and long, the next minute gone. I had made soup. Victor had managed half a bowl, which was good for him, better than most nights. We were watching television, one of those old nature documentaries he loved, the kind with the slow, patient narration about animals surviving impossible odds. Adrian and Lila had a key. I had given it to them months earlier. Adrian had asked, said it would make things easier when they visited, said something about not wanting to buzz and wake his father. I hadn't thought twice about it. I should have. They didn't knock. I heard the door open, heard their voices before I even registered what was happening. I remember thinking, oh, they're early. I didn't know they were coming. And then I stood up from the couch with the instinct of a host, ready to offer coffee, ready to smile. And then I read the room. Adrian had on a suit, not visiting clothes, a suit, the kind he wore to business meetings. Lila was behind him, with a folder tucked under her arm. She was dressed sharply too, and she had a look on her face I had never seen before, not on her, a kind of settled, decided look, like something had already been concluded somewhere else, in some other room, and this was just the formality. "Mom," Adrian said. He didn't say hello. He said Mom, and the way he said it, flat, preemptive, like a warning, made something cold move through my chest. "We need to talk." "Okay," I said. And because I am who I am, I said, "Do you want some soup? I just made—" "We're not here for soup." That was Lila, her first sentence, her voice clipped, her eyes going to the walls, the furniture, the corners of the room, the way they always did. Only this time she wasn't pretending otherwise. Victor shifted in his recliner, slowly. He had heard. I looked at my son, my child, the baby I had held in a hospital room 43 years ago, the boy whose nightmares I had sat beside, whose broken collarbone I had cried over in the ER, whose wedding I had helped pay for when they were short. And I saw a stranger looking back at me. "What's going on?" I asked. Adrian straightened his jacket. He glanced at his father, then back at me. Then he said with a terrible practiced calm, "We've decided that it's time to restructure how this property is managed. Dad can't take care of things anymore. You're getting older. The house needs proper oversight." Proper oversight. I stared at him. "This is my home." "It's a significant asset," Lila said, "and right now it's being underutilized." Underutilized. Like it was a parking lot. Like 40 years of my life was real estate inventory. "Lila," I started. "Mom," Adrian cut me off. His voice was still calm, but there was something under it now, something harder. "We've already consulted with a lawyer. We have documentation. The transfer paperwork is ready. We're not asking for a fight here. We're asking you to be reasonable." That word, reasonable. I have learned over 67 years that when someone asks you to be reasonable while handing you terms they've drafted without your knowledge, they don't mean reasonable. They mean compliant. They mean quiet. They mean don't make this hard for us. "What transfer paperwork?" My voice was steady, steadier than I expected. Adrian opened his mouth and I saw a flicker of something. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears, maybe, confusion, the kind of elderly disorientation he'd probably counted on. "The property transfer. We're moving the house into a family trust. It's the responsible thing." "Adrian," Victor spoke. Quiet, deliberate. From the recliner, with his oxygen tube still looped under his nose, this man who could barely walk to the kitchen and back, he spoke, and his voice had a gravity to it that stopped the room. "Don't." Adrian looked at his father. Something crossed his face. Guilt, maybe. Briefly. Then it was gone. "Dad, this isn't your decision anymore. This isn't your decision anymore. You want to know what being punched in the soul feels like. It feels like watching your husband, who spent 41 years of his life building something, be told by his own son that he no longer has a voice in it. Get out of my house, I said. I surprised myself with how steady I sounded. Adrian's jaw tightened. Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not making anything hard, I said. I'm telling you to leave. This is my home, mine and your father's. You don't have the right to come in here with papers we never agreed to and start talking about assets and oversight like we're... I stopped. I took a breath. Get out. Lila stepped forward. And what she said next, I will carry it with me for the rest of my life. Marianne, her voice was almost gentle. Almost. The house is already transferred. The paperwork went through this morning. We're doing you the courtesy of telling you in person. The room went very quiet, even the television. The soft narration about some animal in some wilderness seemed to fade. What did you say? I heard my voice from somewhere distant. The documents were signed, Adrian said. His eyes didn't meet mine when he said it. Weeks ago, it was all legal. You can have an attorney look at it if you want, but signed by whom? I asked. A pause, a short pause that lasted about 100 years. By Dad, Lila said. He signed them. I looked at Victor. Victor looked at me, and in his eyes, those careful, tired brown eyes, there was something I had not expected to see. Not guilt, not conspiracy, something closer to grief, like he had been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. "Victor," I said very quietly, "what is she talking about?" He opened his mouth, his lips pressed together, and then he said just above a whisper, "Marion, I need to tell you something. I should have told you a long time ago." I'm going to stop here for a moment, because here's what you need to understand about the next few hours of my life. I have played them back so many times in my head that they've lost the feeling of memory and taken on the feeling of a dream, a bad one. The kind where the ground keeps shifting under your feet and you can't quite find where to stand. Adrian and Lila weren't finished, not even close. "Your father has been diagnosed with early cognitive decline," Adrian said, and the words came out smooth, prepared. "He's not in a position to make sound decisions about the property. We had a specialist evaluate him. We have the paperwork, and the conclusion was that a family trust was the most protective arrangement." "You had your father evaluated?" The words came out of me in pieces. "Without telling me?" It wasn't something we wanted to cause unnecessary stress over. Unnecessary stress. They had taken my husband to a specialist, had him declared cognitively impaired, had used that declaration to sign over our home, and they were concerned about my stress levels. "I want to see the documents," I said. "Of course," Adrian said, with the magnanimous ease of a man who believes he's already won. He nodded to Lila, and she opened her folder and extended a stack of papers toward me. I took them. My hands were shaking, only a little, but enough that I noticed it, and I hated myself for it because I didn't want them to see that they'd shaken me. I flipped through the pages. Legal language, Victor's signature, a notary stamp, an assessment from a doctor whose name I didn't recognize. "This doctor," I said. "Who is he?" "A certified specialist." "Who paid for the consultation?" Brief pause. "We arranged it as a family." "You arranged it. You paid for it." And the doctor concluded exactly what you needed him to conclude. I set the papers down. My voice somehow was still level. "You paid someone to declare your father incompetent so you could take our house. That's not—" "Adrian," I looked at him, just looked at him. "I am your mother, and I am telling you very clearly that I know exactly what this is." Something flickered in his expression. For just a moment, just a half second, I saw it, not quite shame. Something in the neighborhood of it. A recognition that he knew what he was doing and was doing it anyway, and that his mother seeing it so clearly was an inconvenience he hadn't fully accounted for. Then Lila's hand touched his arm, light, steady, a recalibration, and the moment passed. "We're not here to fight," Lila said. "We're here to make a transition as comfortable as possible. We'll renovate the upstairs, give you and Victor a proper suite. You won't have to worry about maintenance, about bills, about any of it. You can just rest," I offered. "Exactly. You want me to rest," I said slowly. "In a suite, in my own home, that you've taken from me." I let that sit for a moment. "And if I don't agree to this arrangement," another pause, longer this time. "The property transfer is already complete," Adrian said. "This isn't about agreement." That was the moment, that exact moment, when I understood that this was not a negotiation, this was a notification. They had not come here to discuss anything. They had come here because they needed my physical compliance, needed me to know what had happened, needed me to go quietly to whatever corner they designated for me. And they had dressed it up in the language of family and care and practicality. But underneath it all was a very simple thing. They thought I was helpless. They thought the old woman in the soup-smelling kitchen was finished. I excused myself to use the bathroom. Partly because I genuinely needed a moment, partly because I had learned in 41 years of marriage and 67 years of living that sometimes the best strategy is to disappear for 90 seconds and let people fill the silence with their own assumptions. In the small bathroom of the hallway, I gripped the edge of the sink and looked at my reflection. Arthritic fingers. A bad hip. 32 years of garden calluses on my palms. You are not finished, I told myself. I came back out. I sat in my chair. I asked, with the perfect tone of someone who has accepted her circumstances, whether they wanted coffee. Lila looked almost pleased. That would be lovely, actually. I made the coffee. I smiled when I set it down. I listened while Adrian outlined what the transition would look like, what renovations they were planning, how they thought the basement might be used for storage while the main floors were being redone. Temporarily, of course, just while the work is happening, and I nodded in the right places. And I memorized everything, every word, every name, every timeline they mentioned, every small piece of overconfidence they handed me without realizing it was ammunition. I nodded and smiled and kept my voice warm and wondered if they had any idea what kind of woman they were dealing with. I don't think they did. The crew showed up the following morning. I had not expected that. I suppose I should have, but somewhere in the rational part of my brain I had assumed there would be time. A few days at least, some window of civil procedure. I was wrong about that too. It was 7 in the morning when the van pulled up. 2 men with a dolly. Adrian behind them in that suit again, and Lila with a clipboard, in my house. We're going to get you set up downstairs for now, Adrian said. He was brisk, efficient. Like this was a project he'd finally gotten to move on. It won't be for long. The renovation crew starts next Monday. Downstairs, I repeated. The basement, Lila clarified. She said it without flinching. It's actually quite spacious. We'll bring your things, set it up comfortably. Victor too. There's a bedroom area we can partition off. I looked at my husband. Victor had barely spoken that morning. He'd eaten half a piece of toast, taken his medications, and settled back into his recliner with the distant look of a man who had already been somewhere else in his head for quite some time. Victor can't manage stairs, I said. There's the lift we can install. He's on oxygen. He needs to be close to Marion. Adrian's voice had an edge now. The morning light seemed to have burned through whatever veneer of patience he'd maintained the night before. This is happening. We're trying to make it as easy as possible. Don't make it hard. Don't make it hard. My son said those words to me in the house where I taught him to read. I didn't cry. I want you to know that. I did not cry. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, and I did not cry because they didn't deserve my tears. They hadn't earned that much. I'll need my medications, I said, my garden tools, the heating pads for my hip. We'll bring what you need, Lila said crisply, already making a note on her clipboard. The 2 men with the dolly loaded our things onto it with the impersonal efficiency of people doing a job. They didn't meet my eyes. I didn't blame them. They were being paid, and whatever story they'd been told, it wasn't the real one. Victor could not manage the stairs, so Adrian and one of the men helped him down. I watched that, and it was the hardest thing I watched that day. My husband, who had been a broad-shouldered man once, capable and solid, being helped down into a basement by his own son, who was also the reason he needed to go there. I carried my own things, 3 cardboard boxes, my medications, my address book, a photograph of Adrian as a baby, the one where he's asleep on my chest in the hospital, and I look like I might cry from the sheer weight of loving someone that much. I brought it because I couldn't leave it behind, not even then, maybe especially then. See. The basement of my house was not terrible, that's the honest truth, and I'll give it to you honestly. It was cool and dry. Victor's recliner had been brought down. A space heater was plugged in. There was a folding table and 2 mismatched chairs, and a cot that one of the men had assembled with surprising speed. But here is what a basement is. No matter how it's appointed, it is underground. It is below. And when they left and the door clicked shut above us, the sound of it, that ordinary domestic click, felt like something else entirely. Victor sank into his recliner. I sat on the edge of the cot. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The space heater hummed. Somewhere above us, footsteps moved across the floor, our floor, with a comfortable proprietary ease. A voice, Lila's, talking on a phone. A laugh, Adrian's, short and satisfied. "I'm sorry," Victor said. His voice, when it came, was rough. Not from the emphysema, or not only from that. Something else roughened it. "Tell me what she meant," I said. "Last night. What you said to me and that you needed to tell me something." He was quiet for a moment. His hands rested on the arms of the recliner. I noticed, not for the first time, that his hands had aged faster than the rest of him. The skin was thin, the veins prominent, the knuckles thick. Hands that had built furniture, changed diapers, gripped mine through 2 miscarriages and 1 difficult surgery, and the long grey years of building a life. "Victor, there's a loose brick," he said, "on the east wall, down here." His eyes moved toward the far wall of the basement, behind the workbench. I looked at him. "I've kept some documents there," he said. "For a long time. I always thought I'd find the right time to tell you. And then I'd think, not yet, not yet." He exhaled slowly. "I suppose now is the time." "What kind of documents?" He looked at me. And for a moment he looked not like the ill, diminished man he'd become, but like the man I had married, steady and complicated, and more afraid than he ever admitted. "The kind that changed things," he said. I stood up. My hip protested. I walked to the east wall, to the workbench Victor had built down there 20 years ago, the one cluttered with old tools and dried-out paint cans. I pressed my hands along the bricks of the wall behind it, 3rd row from the bottom, near the corner. 1 brick shifted, loose. Just as he'd said, I worked it free. It took a minute, both hands, my arthritic fingers screaming, and behind it was a gap in the wall, a hollow about the size of a shoebox, and inside it, wrapped in a plastic bag yellowed with age, was a stack of papers. I brought them to the light. I read. I read while Victor was silent in his recliner, watching me with those careful brown eyes of his, watching me the way you watch someone open something you've been carrying alone for almost 4 decades, not knowing whether the opening of it will be relief or ruin. I read for a long time. And the more I read, the more the room shifted around me, not literally, but in the way of understanding, in the way of, so that's what it was, in the way of a picture snapping suddenly into focus after a lifetime of blur. When I finished, I held the papers in my hands and looked at my husband. "Victor," I said, and my voice was very quiet, "you were adopted." He nodded once, slowly. "The Hale name," I started, "is not mine," he said, "not by blood." A pause. "I found out when I was 29. My parents, the ones who raised me, they sat me down and told me, showed me the original documents, told me that the family I'd been born into." He stopped, coughed, steadied himself. "They told me it was better I didn't know more, that the family had a history that was better left buried. They changed everything when they adopted me, made it legal, clean. They gave me a good life." He looked at the floor. "I kept the originals, I don't know why. Couldn't bring myself to throw them away." "And Adrian," I said, "Adrian worships the Hale name. He's built his whole identity on it." Victor said nothing. I understood. The name Adrian had used his entire adult life, the name he'd leveraged in professional circles, used as a mark of distinction, worn like a suit of armor, was not his by blood. It was a borrowed name, a name that belonged to a man who had been given it by kind strangers, not by lineage. The story Adrian thought he was the heir of was not his story at all. I sat with that for a long time, in the cool quiet of the basement, with my husband breathing carefully beside me and the footsteps of my son moving overhead. I was not a violent woman. I was not vindictive. I had spent my whole life trying not to be either of those things. But something was waking up in me, down there in the dark, something that had been patient for too long, something that had bitten its cheek too many times. Something that had nodded and smiled and made coffee and given keys to people who were already planning to use them against me. I folded the papers carefully, placed them back in the plastic bag, and I did not put them back behind the brick. I put them in the inner pocket of my cardigan, close to my chest, where I could feel them every time I breathed. They thought they'd already won. That was their first mistake. And as I sat in my basement, in my house, listening to my son laugh at something his wife had said on the other side of the ceiling above my head, I began, for the first time in months, to feel something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, not grief, purpose. Ease. That night, after Victor had taken his medications and fallen into the shallow, fitful sleep of a man whose body has been negotiating with itself for years, I sat at the folding table with a small notepad I'd had in my cardigan pocket. I always kept one, an old habit. And I wrote down everything I could remember, the name of the doctor who'd done Victor's assessment, the timeline Adrian had mentioned. The phrase went through this morning, which meant the paperwork had been filed somewhere, and filings leave records. I wrote down the name Evelyn Cross, which I remembered from a news article I'd read the previous spring. A sharp attorney in town who had represented an elderly couple in a property fraud case and had won in a way that had been described, even in the dry legal reporting, as decisive. I had never needed an attorney in my life. I thought that was about to change. Above me, my house settled into the night with its familiar sounds, the third step creaking, the pipes contracting against the cold, all the small, intimate noises that belong to a place you know by heart. I know every inch of you, I thought, and I'm coming back. The first night in the basement, I didn't sleep. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it matters. Because what happens in the hours when everyone else is sleeping, when the house is quiet and the space heater hums and your husband's breathing is the only sound you're anchored to, those hours are when you find out what you're actually made of. Not the version of yourself you've performed for 40 years, the real one. The one underneath all the patience and the casseroles and the carefully measured responses. I sat at that folding table with my notepad, and I wrote until my arthritic fingers ached so badly I had to stop and press them flat against my thighs and breathe through it. Then I started again. By 3 a.m, I had filled 6 pages. The name of the doctor. The notary stamp. I'd noticed the name even in my shock, because I am that kind of woman. The kind who reads the fine print even when her hands are shaking. The timeline. The specific phrase Lila had used went through this morning, which meant a courthouse, which meant a filing date, which meant a paper trail that existed somewhere outside of whatever stack of documents they'd handed me. And underneath all of it, in the inner pocket of my cardigan, the papers from behind the brick. Victor's real history. Wrapped in a bag that had yellowed with nearly 40 years of waiting. I kept touching it through the fabric, not to read it again. I had already memorized most of it. But as a reminder that the thing Adrian had built his identity on, the name he'd used like currency in every room he'd ever walked into, was not what he thought it was. I wasn't sure yet what I would do with that. I was sure I would do something. Outside, past the small basement window set high on the east wall, the October night was still and cold, no wind, just a deep pressed quiet, and inside it I sat and planned, and the planning felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in days. I was not, as I said, a dramatic woman, but I was a thorough one, and thoroughness, I have found, is far more dangerous than drama. The morning came the way mornings do when you haven't slept. Not with any real arrival, just a gradual greying of the dark, the small basement window shifting from black to charcoal to the flat white of an overcast dawn. Victor stirred around 6:30. I heard him before I saw him move. The particular rhythm of him waking, the careful adjustment of his oxygen tube, the low sound he made that wasn't quite a groan and wasn't quite a sigh, but somewhere between the two. "You didn't sleep," he said. He didn't ask. He knew. "I was thinking," I said. He watched me from the recliner. In the grey morning light, he looked older than he had even the day before, which I hadn't thought was possible. Whatever energy had animated him through the previous evening, the gravity of finally speaking, the weight being lifted, seemed to have cost him something. He looked spent. Marion, he said, you need to understand something about what I showed you last night. I understand it, I said. You understand the documents. I don't think you understand the... He stopped, coughed, a slow, deep one that took a moment to clear. The fuller picture. I put down my pen. Tell me. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet I could hear him deciding how much to say, the way he always did. That characteristic pause of his, the one I used to find maddeningly withholding, and now recognized as the habit of a man who had learned, very young, to be careful with words. The family I was born into, he said finally. The biological family. They didn't disappear. They dissolved over years. Some of them went to prison. Some of them lost everything in ways that weren't accidental. The name itself, the original name before the adoption, it was tied to that history. That's why my parents changed it. That's why they were so careful. He paused. The Hale name is clean because they gave it to me, but what I was born into was not. I looked at him, and Adrian doesn't know any of this. Adrian, Victor said very quietly, has spent his entire life believing that the Hale name is old money, respectability, a bloodline worth inheriting. He exhaled. He's told people that. He's built things on that story. I thought of the way Adrian talked in professional settings, the careful dropping of his family name, the implication that he came from somewhere solid, somewhere established. He'd never been dishonest about money because there was no old money to lie about. But there had always been a suggestion of something, a lineage, a quality. It was a story built on something Victor had never chosen to tell him. You should have told him, I said. Victor nodded. Yes. You should have told me. Yes. A pause. I was afraid. I didn't push on that, not then. There would be time. I hoped there would be time for the longer conversation, for the one where I told him honestly how it felt to have spent 41 years with someone and learn, in a basement where your son had locked you, that there were things he'd kept sealed behind a brick. But that conversation required more of me than I had available in that moment. And Victor's face had taken on a particular exhausted transparency that told me it required more of him too. Rest, I said. What are you going to do? I'm going to make a phone call, I said. As soon as I can figure out how. Here was the problem with that. I did not have my phone. In the chaos of being moved to the basement, the men with the dolly, Adrian's efficient briskness, the deliberate fog of that morning, I had not thought to hold on to my phone. It had been on the kitchen counter charging, and I had simply not thought to grab it, which meant it was somewhere upstairs in a house that was no longer legally mine, in the hands of people who were not inclined to bring it to me. This was not an accident. I understood that immediately in the morning light of the second day, whether it had been calculated or whether I'd simply handed them the advantage without realizing, it didn't matter. The result was the same. I was in a basement with no phone, no car keys. Those had been in my purse, which Lila had offered to bring down later and had not, and no obvious way to reach the outside world, which meant my first problem wasn't Evelyn Cross, the attorney. It wasn't the documents, or the notary stamp, or the forged assessment. My first problem was a phone call. Adrian came downstairs mid-morning with a plate of toast and 2 cups of coffee. He set them on the folding table without ceremony. He was in jeans now, not the suit, and in some ways that was worse. The jeans meant he was comfortable here, meant he was already moving through this house like it was his, like the suit had been the formal occasion, and this was just ordinary life now. How'd you sleep? He asked. I looked at him. My son, 43 years old, still with that jaw he'd had since he was a teenager, square, slightly stubborn. He had Victor's eyes, or what I'd always believed were Victor's eyes, but looking at him now, I found myself examining his face differently, looking for the thing underneath the thing, the way you do when a story you knew has been rewritten. I didn't, I said. He had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. The cot isn't great. We can get a better one. I don't need a better cot, Adrian. I need my phone. He shifted his weight. We're keeping electronics limited right now. while the renovation is being planned. There's a lot of coordination happening, and we don't want... You're keeping my phone from me, I said very evenly. That's what you're doing. Let's call it what it is. His jaw tightened. Mom, and my car keys, which were in my purse, which Lila said she'd bring down and hasn't. The car is being serviced. My car. Yes, it needed work. I watched him. He met my eyes for approximately 2 seconds before looking at the plate of toast he'd brought, adjusting its position on the table slightly, a pointless gesture that told me everything I needed to know about how comfortable he actually was with this conversation. Victor needs his medications refilled in 2 weeks, I said. He has a pulmonologist appointment on the 15th. We'll handle his appointments. You'll handle his appointments, I repeated. The flatness of my own voice surprised me. I had expected to feel desperate in these moments, and I didn't. I felt very clear. Adrian, look at me. He did, reluctantly. I know what you think is happening here, I said. You think you've managed a situation. You think you've been smart about this. You think because you have a piece of paper with your father's signature on it and a doctor's note and a notary stamp, you've done something legal. I paused. But you have not thought this through, and the longer you keep me in this basement, the worse it is going to get for you. His expression shifted. Something moved through it. Not quite fear, but its neighbor. Something that said he'd prepared for tears and deflection, and had not fully prepared for this particular tone. Nothing is going to get worse for anyone, he said. This is a family decision. Bring me a phone, I said, or I will find another way to make contact with the outside world, and you will not like how that looks for you when it becomes part of a legal record. He stared at me. I picked up the toast and took a bite. He left without another word, and his footsteps on the stairs, going up, back into his house, had a slightly different way to them than they'd had going down. Good. He came back 40 minutes later with a phone. Not mine. A prepaid one, the kind you bought at a gas station. He set it on the table beside the coffee cup. Limited use, he said, for emergencies. I nodded pleasantly. Thank you. He lingered for a moment as if he expected me to say something else. When I didn't, he went back upstairs. I waited. I gave him 20 minutes to settle into whatever he was doing up there, to convince himself that the phone was a controlled concession, that the number of contacts I could reach on a prepaid cell was limited, that the situation was still his. Then I dialed the only number I knew by heart other than Victor's. My oldest friend, Dorothy Marsh, picked up on the third ring. Marion. Her voice cracked immediately. She had caller ID and the number wouldn't have matched mine. And Dorothy had been a worrier for as long as I'd known her, which was going on 45 years. Why are you calling from... Dot, I said, keeping my voice very steady and very quiet. I need you to find a phone number for me. An attorney named Evelyn Cross. She's in town. I need the number and I need you to not call this number back. Write down the number I'm calling from. I gave it to her. And Dot, I need you to come by the house tomorrow. Come to the front door and don't call ahead. A long pause. Marion, Dorothy said carefully, what's going on? I'll explain when I see you. Can you do this for me? Another pause. Dorothy was not a dramatic woman either. It was part of why we'd been friends so long. That matching preference for practicality over performance. But even through the phone, even in the silence, I could feel her recalibrating, reading the situation the way a careful woman reads a situation. Yes, she said, I can do this. Don't mention it to Adrian if he calls you. Has he ever called me in the past 10 years? No, I admitted. Then we should be fine, Dorothy said, and there was something in her voice, a dry warmth, a settling in, that made my chest loosen just slightly, just enough to breathe a little more deeply than I had in 2 days. I thanked her. I hung up. Victor had been watching me from the recliner this whole time, quiet, pretending to watch the small television that had been brought downstairs, though I noticed he hadn't turned the volume up enough to hear it properly. He was listening to me. When I set the phone down, he said, Dorothy. Dorothy. He nodded slowly. Smart. I have my moments, I said, for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Something moved across his face that might, at a stretch, have been called a smile. The day passed with the slow, specific indignity of enforced helplessness. Adrian came down twice more, once to inform me that a renovation planner was coming Thursday to look at the kitchen, once to bring down sandwiches at noon, with the careful manner of someone delivering meals to an inconvenience they're managing. Lila did not come down at all. I could hear her upstairs, though, her particular step slightly harder on the right foot, and her voice on calls, the crisp professional cadence of a woman conducting business in a house that still smelled like someone else's life. I organized. I know that sounds strange, but there is something in me, something that has been there as long as I can remember, that responds to crisis by getting very tidy. When Adrian was 7 and broke his collarbone falling from the backyard fence, I didn't panic in the ER. I made a list of questions for the doctor. When Victor's first cardiac scare came 15 years ago, I sat in the hospital waiting room and arranged our insurance documents into labeled folders. It is how I function. It is how I have always functioned. So I organized the basement. I arranged our medications on the shelf above the workbench in order of morning versus evening dosing. I found a flashlight in one of the boxes they'd brought down and checked the batteries. Good. I checked the window latch once it opened, though the window itself was too small for anything practical. I assessed the space heater for how many hours it could run before the room got cold, and made a note to ask Adrian for extra blankets, phrasing the request in the mild, non-confrontational tone of someone who has accepted her circumstances, because the worst thing I could do was tip my hand too early. I did not put the papers from behind the brick back in the wall. I kept them on me. The cardigan had become my armor. That evening, after Victor had settled into sleep and the house had gone quiet above me, I took the papers out again and read them in the light of the small lamp on the folding table. The documents told a story that was both simpler and more complicated than I'd initially processed. Victor had been born under a different surname, one that I won't repeat here because it doesn't matter. What matters is what that name carried with it. According to the papers, a combination of birth certificates, adoption records, and one private investigator's report that Victor's adoptive parents had apparently commissioned and then handed to him along with everything else. The family he'd been born into had been involved in a series of financial frauds spanning almost a decade. Not violent crime, not dramatic headline crime. The slow, grinding, deliberate kind, falsified assessments, forged documents, property stolen through paperwork rather than force. I read that last part twice. Forged documents, property stolen through paperwork. The bitter irony of it settled over me like a cold cloth. Adrian was attempting to steal this house through exactly the same method that his grandfather's biological family had used to steal from others. He didn't know it. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was being modern and strategic and legally protected. He had no idea that he was, in some terrible genetic coincidence, repeating a pattern he didn't even know existed in the bloodline he mistakenly believed was his. Not that patterns work that way. I'm not a superstitious woman, but the parallelism of it was not lost on me. Sitting there in the basement, the lamp making a small, warm circle in the dark, I thought about what I would do with these documents, how they fit, or whether they fit, into whatever legal strategy Evelyn Cross might help me build. The property transfer was the urgent thing. That was the primary wrong. Everything else was secondary to the question of whether that transfer was legally sound, whether the document had been signed by a man who had been properly evaluated, or one whose evaluation had been manufactured to reach a predetermined conclusion. But the story of Victor's adoption, the truth about the Hale name, that was leverage of a different kind, and I was beginning to understand, down there in the quiet of that basement, that when you are fighting from a position of apparent weakness, leverage is everything. Not because you intend to be cruel with it, But because the people who have put you in a position of weakness have already demonstrated that they're not playing by the rules of decency, and playing by those rules unilaterally is not nobility, it's surrender. I was done surrendering. Dorothy came the next morning at 10 o'clock. I heard the doorbell from the basement, heard the pause, the footsteps, heard Adrian's voice at the door and then Dorothy's, and I pressed every patient instinct I had into not moving, not making a sound, letting whatever was happening upstairs play itself out. 15 minutes passed. Then footsteps on the basement stairs and the door opened, and there was Dorothy. 64 years old, white-haired now, where she used to be red, with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the look she always got when she was composing herself, the slight set of her jaw, the deliberate evenness of her breath. She looked around the basement. She looked at the cot, the folding table, the space heater. She looked at Victor in his recliner. She looked at me. I watched her take it all in, and I watched something move through her face that she did not allow herself to put into words, because she is also that kind of woman. "Dorothy," Victor said quietly, "it's good to see you." "Victor," her voice was careful, "you too." She came and sat across from me at the folding table. Adrian had let her in with the explanation that his parents were resting downstairs during the renovation preparation, which was the kind of explanation that sounds almost plausible if you've never seen the actual layout, never seen the basement door, never registered that there were no tools, no ladders, no drop cloths anywhere in a house supposedly undergoing renovation. Dorothy had noticed all of that. "He's watching," she said quietly. He came to the door himself. He was careful about what he said. "He would be," I said. "Did you get it?" She slid a piece of paper across the table. "Evelyn Cross, office address, direct line." "I called her office before I came," Dorothy said, "just to ask about availability. They said she's booked, but she takes urgent referrals." A pause. "I may have implied there was urgency." "There is urgency." Dorothy looked at me. Her eyes, which were the pale blue of winter sky, had always had an uncanny ability to convey exactly what she was thinking without her having to say it. What they were conveying now was something between fury and a very controlled love. "Marian," she said, "how did this happen?" "Slowly," I said, "and then all at once." She nodded. She understood that. She was 64, and she had been through enough of her own life to understand that most catastrophes are built gradually in small, accepted compromises, and then one morning you wake up and the whole structure is already standing, and you're inside it and the door is locked. "What do you need from me?" she asked. This is where I want to pause and tell you something about Dorothy Marsh, because she deserves more than to be a footnote in this story. She had known me since we were both 22 years old and living in the same apartment building. Both of us broke and young and absolutely convinced we were going to figure everything out. She had been at my wedding. She had held my hand in the hospital after the second miscarriage, the one that was further along, the one that took a long time to recover from. She had been the only person I told years ago, when Victor and I hit the period in our marriage where we weren't sure we were going to make it. 2 years of distance and low conversations, and the particular loneliness of being unhappy inside something you've committed your life to. She knew me with a completeness that required no explanation and very little setup. And she was sitting in my basement, the basement where my son had put me, with her reading glasses on her forehead and her jaw set and her eyes absolutely blazing with a controlled, practical fury on my behalf. "I need you to be my contact with the outside world," I said. "I need you to call Evelyn Cross's office and make an appointment. Tell them, there's a potential property fraud case. Tell them it's urgent. Don't give my name yet." I thought for a moment. "And I need you to check something at the county courthouse, the property records. I want to know exactly what was filed and when and under what circumstances." Dorothy wrote this down on a small notebook she'd brought in her purse. She didn't ask why or how. She just wrote it down. And then she looked up. "And what are you going to do while I'm doing all that?" "I'm going to keep being very calm," I said. She looked at me steadily. Marion, you're living in a basement. I know. In your own house. I know. And you're going to. I'm going to be very calm, I said again, because they are waiting for me to fall apart. They have designed this entire situation around the expectation that I will cry and beg and be impossible to deal with, or else that I'll simply go quiet and stop fighting. Those are the two options they've planned for. I folded my hands on the table. I'm not going to give them either one. Dorothy looked at me for a long moment. Then she clicked her pen. All right, she said, I'll call Cross's office this afternoon. She stayed for another 30 minutes. She drank a cup of coffee from the small percolator I'd asked Adrian to bring down. He'd brought it grudgingly the previous morning, which I'd requested specifically because it made us look cooperative and because I genuinely needed coffee to think. She talked to Victor. She was gentle with him, kind, asked him about the nature documentary series he'd been watching, and I watched Victor's face ease slightly at being spoken to like a person rather than a problem. When she left, she squeezed my hand at the basement door. Don't let them see you sweat, she said. I never have, I said. She went upstairs. I heard her say something pleasant to Adrian at the door, something about how nice it would be to see the renovation when it was finished. And I heard Adrian's response, slightly warmer than it should have been, the particular warmth of a man who mistakes graciousness for approval. He thought Dorothy's visit had been what it appeared to be. He had absolutely no idea. The next several days had a terrible rhythm to them. Adrian came down morning and evening with food. Never elaborate, the kind of meals that said maintenance rather than care, sandwiches and soup, and once a container of leftover pasta that had clearly come from a restaurant. He asked after Victor. He spoke to me in the careful, slightly elevated voice that people use when they want to sound reasonable while doing unreasonable things. He did not mention the phone. He did not offer to return my car keys. He did not suggest that the arrangement was temporary in any specific or believable way. Lila came down once. Just once, on the third day, and she stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the space with an assessing eye and said in a tone of considerable self-satisfaction, "We're thinking of opening up the east wall for the renovation. It'll really open the space up." I looked at her. My face gave nothing away. "Which wall?" "That one." She gestured toward the east wall. The wall with the workbench. The wall behind which 3 days ago I had found the documents that had rewritten my understanding of the past 40 years. I had, of course, filled the hollow with crumpled newspaper and replaced the brick securely that first morning. There was nothing behind it anymore except old paper. But the thing Lila didn't know, would never know, was that the document was no longer there. It was in my cardigan, which had become, functionally, my vault. "That sounds nice," I said pleasantly. Lila gave me a brief smile, the kind she always gave, polished, surface level, designed for the impression of warmth without any of its substance. Then she went back upstairs, her footsteps quick and assured. I turned back to Victor. He'd been watching the whole exchange with those quiet brown eyes of his. "She almost seems happy," he said. "She got what she wanted," I said. "People tend to seem happy when that happens." "Do you think she knew from the beginning that this was what Adrian was planning?" I thought about it, really thought about it, not the emotional answer, but the structural one. "I think," I said slowly, "that Lila has wanted this house for a very long time. I think Adrian wanted it too, but differently. He wanted the name, the legacy, the idea of inheriting something. Lila wanted the asset, the property value, the square footage." I paused. "And I think that at some point, those two desires found each other and shook hands, and that's when this whole thing was born." Victor was quiet for a moment. "I should have seen it. We both should have." "No." He shook his head slightly. "You gave them the benefit of the doubt because you're their family. That's not blindness, that's love. I should have seen it because I was watching them differently. I saw what Lila was doing, and I told myself it was paranoia." The admission cost him something. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the particular tightness of a man confronting a failure he can't undo. "Victor," I said, The documents you kept, the ones behind the brick. Why now? Why tell me now when we're here like this?" He looked at his hands. "Because I thought if they won," he said slowly, "if they walked away with everything and I was not here to contest it, you would need something, some way to fight back." He paused. "And because it was the last thing I still had to give you, I didn't say anything for a long time." Outside, the October light moved across the small basement window in the way it does when the leaves are down and there's nothing to filter it. Clean and cold and utterly indifferent. "It's enough," I said finally. "It's more than enough." On the 5th day, Dorothy called the prepaid phone. I answered on the first ring. "She'll see you," Dorothy said. "Evelyn Cross." I explained the situation. Broadly, not everything. And her assistant said she's had 2 similar cases in the past 3 years. Property transfers executed under questionable competency assessments. A pause. She wants to meet Thursday, her office. Thursday was 3 days away. Thursday was a problem because I was in a basement. But I am a thorough woman, and thorough women solve one problem at a time. "Tell her Thursday is fine," I said. "I'll be there." "How?" Dorothy asked. And in the single syllable of that question was 45 years of friendship. The specific skepticism of someone who knew me well enough to know that I didn't make promises I hadn't already figured out how to keep. "I'll call you tomorrow night," I said. "I'll have something worked out by then." I hung up. I looked at Victor. "Thursday," I told him. He nodded. Then, "You should sleep, Marion. You've slept maybe 4 hours in 5 days." "I know." "Sleep," he said. "The fight will still be there in the morning." He was right. I lay down on the cot, still in the cardigan, the papers a flat pressure against my ribs, and I closed my eyes. And for the first time since this had begun, I felt something in me that was not merely exhaustion or determination, but something older and quieter, and more enduring than either. I felt like myself, not the managed version, not the careful wife and accommodating mother, not the woman who had bitten her cheek and made coffee and smiled through things that deserved more than a smile. The real version, the one who'd been sitting in there underneath all that patience, waiting for a reason to get up. She was up now. And somewhere above me, my son and his wife moved through my house with the easy confidence of people who believed they had already won. The confidence of people who had never really looked at the woman they were underestimating. That was their second mistake. Thursday came the way important days always do, indistinguishable from any other morning until you remember what's in it. I had actually slept for the 2 nights prior. Not well. Not the deep, untroubled sleep of someone without a problem, but the functional sleep of someone conserving energy for something that mattered. I had learned that about myself in the basement, that my body, when I gave it permission, could separate urgency from panic. I had urgent things to do. Panicking would not help me do them. The question of how to get out of the house on Thursday had resolved itself in a way I hadn't predicted, but should have. 2 days before the appointment, Adrian had told me, with the casual authority of a man who no longer considered his words carefully around me, that he and Lila would be out Thursday morning. A meeting with a contractor, he said. Something about the kitchen demolition schedule. They would be gone from 9 until at least noon. He told me this because he believed it was irrelevant information. Because in his mind, I was managed. I was in the basement, I had a prepaid phone with limited contacts, I had no car keys, and I was 67 years old with arthritic fingers and a bad hip. The variables, as he saw them, were controlled. What he had not considered, because people who underestimate you rarely consider the full picture, was Dorothy. Dorothy had a car. Dorothy had, at my request, conveyed through a phone call the previous evening, agreed to pull up to the back of the house, the garden side invisible from the street, at 9:15 Thursday morning. The basement had a window. The window was small, high on the east wall, and it opened outward on a latch that I had, over the previous several days, been carefully, quietly oiling with a small bottle of WD-40 I'd found among Victor's workbench supplies. I want to be clear, I am 67 years old with a bad hip and arthritic fingers, and what I am about to describe was neither dignified nor painless. I had told Victor the plan the night before. He had listened with his characteristic stillness, and when I finished, he had looked at me for a long moment and said, "The window is 4 feet off the ground." "I know," I said. "Your hip—" "I know." He had pressed his lips together. Then, "There's an old step stool in the back of the workbench cabinet, behind the paint cans." I had found it. A metal one, 2 steps, exactly what I needed. The morning of Thursday, I was dressed by 7. Cardigan on, the papers still in the inner pocket, which by now I had reinforced with a safety pin to make absolutely certain they couldn't fall. And my shoes, which I had kept beside the cot every night, because something about having your shoes nearby when you're in a situation you didn't choose makes you feel slightly less at the mercy of it. At 8:55 I heard the front door close, heard Adrian's car start, heard the sound of it pulling away. I waited 10 minutes. Patience is a discipline. I have had decades of practice. At 9:05 I dragged the step stool to the east wall under the window. I climbed the first step. My hip screamed. I climbed the second. I worked the latch. It moved more smoothly now, the oil having done its job, and pushed the window outward. The morning air came in cold and immediate and smelled of damp leaves and October. I nearly cried at the smell of it. I hadn't been outside in 8 days. Getting through that window was one of the least graceful things I have ever done in my life. I am not going to pretend otherwise. I went sideways, one shoulder first, my bad hip catching on the frame in a way that made me bite down so hard on my own lip that I tasted blood. I scraped my forearm on the concrete lip of the window well. I came out onto the garden side of the house in a controlled fall that was barely controlled, landing on my hands and knees in the cold grass with a force that sent a jolt straight through both wrists. I knelt there for a moment, breathing. The garden was still. The tulip beds were bare. I'd pulled the dead stalks in September before any of this happened, because I'm the kind of woman who tends her garden before winter, whether she's in crisis or not. The air was cold and real and mine in a way that nothing had felt mine in over a week. Dorothy's car was already there, idling quietly at the back fence gate. I stood up. I straightened my cardigan. I walked to the gate, opened it, and got into the passenger seat. Dorothy looked at my scraped forearm and the grass stains on my knees. She looked at my face. She said nothing for a full 3 seconds. Then she said, "Seat belt," and put the car in drive. I loved her so much in that moment I couldn't speak. We drove. The town rolled past the windows and I watched it with the particular intensity of someone who has been deprived of ordinary things and is now cataloguing them. A woman walking a dog, a coffee shop with its lights on, a school bus stopped at a crosswalk, the red of the stoplight against the grey sky. All of it ordinary, all of it, from where I sat, extraordinary. "How's your arm?" Dorothy asked. "Fine," I said. "It's surface." "And your hip?" "Also fine." "You're lying about both." "Yes," I said, "but I'm here, so it doesn't matter." Dorothy's jaw did the thing it did. She didn't push. Evelyn Cross's office was in a building downtown that had once been a bank. You could tell from the high ceilings and the particular quality of the light that financial institution seriousness baked into the architecture. The law office had kept the bones of the place and added warm wood furniture and bookshelves, and a receptionist who looked up when Dorothy and I came in with the practiced warmth of someone trained to make people feel less frightened than they are. We waited 11 minutes. I counted them. Then the receptionist said Ms. Cross would see me, and I walked through a door into an office where a woman was standing behind a desk extending her hand. Evelyn Cross was younger than I expected, mid-40s maybe. She had the kind of face that had probably been underestimated in her early career and had since decided to use that as an advantage. Sharp eyes behind dark-framed glasses, a compact, unhurried manner. She shook my hand with a grip that meant business without performing it. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "sit down. Tell me everything." I sat. I told her everything. I am a thorough woman, and I had spent 8 days in a basement organizing my thoughts, so I did not meander. I laid it out in sequence. The visits, the key, the suits and the clipboard, the paperwork, the doctor's name, the notary stamp, the prepaid phone, the window. I set the documents, the ones from behind the bricks and on her desk. I told her about Victor's adoption, about the biological family history, about the specific texture of what Adrian thought his inheritance was versus what it actually was. Evelyn Cross listened without interrupting. She took notes in a small, precise hand. When I finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not absently, but the way a person looks when they're organizing a great deal of information into its proper structure. Then she looked at me. "The doctor's name," she said, "Dr. Philip Greaves." "Yes, I know that name." Her voice was neutral, but I caught something under it, a quality of recognition that wasn't surprise. He's appeared as an assessing physician in 2 other property transfer cases I'm aware of. Different families, similar circumstances. Elderly parent, adult child, expedited competency assessment, swift transfer. I felt something move through my chest. He's done this before. He's been paid to do this before, Cross said carefully. Whether there's legal exposure for him depends on what we find when we pull the assessment records. But it's a pattern, and patterns are useful in court. She tapped her pen against the notepad. The notary stamp. That's something we can pull from public record. The filing date, the conditions under which the transfer was executed, who witnessed it. We request those records this week. She glanced at the documents from behind the brick. And this, the adoption records, the biological family history. How does that help us? I asked. On its own, the property transfer is a civil matter. Fraudulent execution, potential undue influence, the competency assessment is our main lever there. But your son has built a professional and personal identity around a family name and lineage that isn't his by blood. She paused. That creates leverage. Not in a legal sense. I'm not talking about using this in court directly. I'm talking about the mathematics of what people do when the thing they value most is at risk. I understood her immediately. He'll settle. If he's smart, she said. And even if he's not smart, the threat of what comes out if this goes to discovery, the forged assessment, the questions about Dr. Greaves, the story of what you were put through, that's damaging in ways that go beyond legal consequence. She looked at me steadily. People like your son care about how they appear. They've spent considerable effort constructing an image. Litigation destroys images. I thought of Adrian in his suit, the careful dropping of the family name in professional conversations, the identity he'd built brick by brick on a foundation he didn't know was someone else's. What do we do first? I asked. First, Cross said, we file for an emergency injunction to halt any further changes to the property pending investigation. That stops the renovation. That stops any further transfer of assets. She set down her pen. Second, we send a letter, certified, to your son and his wife, informing them that you have retained counsel and are formally contesting the property transfer on grounds of fraudulent execution and undue influence. When? Today, she said. I'll have the injunction request filed by end of business. The letter goes out tomorrow morning. She paused. Mrs. Hale, I need to ask you something. Ask. Your husband signed the original transfer documents. Whatever the circumstances of that signing, his signature is on them. When we contest the validity of his competency assessment, we're essentially arguing that he was not in the cognitive state to consent. Which is true, I believe, given what you've told me about the doctor. But your husband will need to be available to speak with me. Can he do that? I thought of Victor in the recliner, the oxygen tube, the particular thinness of him now, The way the past year had worked on him like weather on something that used to be solid. He can, I said. He wants to. She nodded. Good. One more thing. She looked at me directly without cushioning it. You went out a basement window this morning to get here. Yes. That means you're going back in through one this afternoon. Yes. And you're going to maintain the appearance of compliance until we're ready to move. Yes. She held my gaze for a moment. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite pity and sat somewhere in the productive space between them. Most clients I see in situations like yours have been ground down by the time they reach me. They come in here already beaten. She picked up her pen. You don't look beaten. I spent 40 years being patient, I said. I can last a little longer. The corner of her mouth moved. Good, because what comes next is going to require it. I went back in through the window. Dorothy drove me home at 11:45, which gave me a 50-minute buffer before Adrian and Lila were due back. I came through the garden gate, crossed the grass in the cold morning air, and went back in through the same window I'd come out of, which was, if anything, harder in the return direction. My hip was throbbing by the time I got through. The scraped forearm caught on the frame again in the same spot. I climbed down the step stool and put it back behind the paint cans. I straightened my cardigan. I sat down at the folding table and picked up the notepad and the pen. When Adrian came down 20 minutes later with a container of leftover soup he heated upstairs, the particular small decency of a man who needed to believe he was not a monster, he found me doing exactly what he expected to find me doing, sitting quietly at the table, writing letters to no one in particular, a manageable old woman in a manageable situation. How are you? He asked. Fine, I said. Quiet day. He set the soup down. He looked around the basement. A brief, satisfied scan, the look of someone confirming that things are where they left them. His eyes went to the east wall, the workbench, the brick wall. Nothing to see, nothing to raise a flag. The contractor meeting went well, he said, offering me something I realized. Some normalcy, some illusion that this was a house where people lived together and shared information. We're thinking of opening up the kitchen into the dining room, make it more of an open plan. My kitchen, the kitchen where I had cooked 32 years of meals, where the window above the sink faced east, because I had specifically asked for an east-facing window when we built this place because I liked to watch the morning light, where I had taught Adrian at age 9 how to make scrambled eggs, where Victor and I had sat at 2 in the morning during the bad years, not talking, just sitting, which was sometimes enough. That sounds nice, I said. He almost looked pleased, the same way Lila had looked almost pleased when I'd agreed that opening the east wall would be nice. They kept being surprised when I didn't fight, and then interpreting my non-fighting as acceptance, because they had never considered the third option, strategy. Get some rest, he said, which was what he always said when he left, and which always landed the same way, with the muffled impact of something that was trying to be care and wasn't quite. He went upstairs. The door clicked. I looked at Victor. He had been pretending to sleep through Adrian's visit. I knew that, could tell by the particular quality of his breathing, the slight tension in his hands. He opened his eyes. Well, he said. She filed today, I said. The injunction. The letter goes out tomorrow. Victor was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his face, something I couldn't fully name, a complicated mixture of things. Relief, possibly. Fear maybe of what came next. The specific dread of a man who had been complicit in his own diminishment and was now watching the machinery reverse. Adrian is going to be very angry, he said. Yes, I said. He's going to come down here and yes, I said. He is. I picked up the pen. I went back to writing in my notepad because there was still planning to do, still things to organize, still details to keep straight. Victor watched me for a moment. Are you afraid? He asked. I considered the question honestly, the way Victor had always appreciated. He had never liked when I smoothed things over, even when I did it habitually. Yes, I said, a little, but not of Adrian. Of what then? I looked at the papers in my cardigan pocket, the documents that had changed the shape of the story. Of being wrong, I said, of having this plan and it not being enough, of doing everything right and still losing. I paused. That's what scares me, not him. Victor nodded slowly. That's not a bad thing to be afraid of, he said. It means you're paying attention. The letter arrived at the house the following morning. I knew the exact moment it did because I heard it. Heard the mail slot, which had a distinctive sound, a quick metallic snap, followed by the soft landing of paper on the hallway floor, and then heard, 30 seconds later, the particular quality of silence that follows when someone picks something up and reads it and does not immediately speak. Then Lila's voice, very controlled, Adrian, then nothing for a while, then footsteps, 2 sets, both moving quickly, then voices too low for me to make out words but not too low to make out tone, which was elevated and sharp and had the character of people who have received unexpected news and are rapidly adjusting their understanding of their position. I sat at the folding table and drank my coffee and kept my face very still. When Adrian came downstairs, he was not carrying food. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and he looked at me, and his face had a quality I had not seen on it before, not in 43 years of knowing this face through all its variations. It was not rage exactly. It was something colder than rage, the look of someone who has discovered that the person they thought they'd already beaten has been playing an entirely different game. You hired a lawyer, he said. I retained counsel, I said. Yes. How? Not a question, a demand. His voice was flat. I'm 67, Adrian, not incompetent. His jaw worked. The phone. You gave me a phone, I said. I used it. A beat. I watched him recalibrate. I watched him go through the logic, the prepaid phone, the limited contacts, Dorothy's visit, the gaps in his supervision. I watched him find the shape of his mistake. The injunction, he said, it won't hold. Our paperwork is solid. Your paperwork includes an assessment from a doctor who has performed the same service for at least 2 other families in similar circumstances, I said. That's a pattern. Patterns look bad in discovery. His eyes changed, just slightly, a contraction, something pulling inward. Where did you hear that? From my attorney, I said, who is also aware of the notary filing date, the timeline, and the specific language used in the competency assessment. I paused. And who is aware of a few other things besides? The few other things, I let that sit. I did not say what the few other things were. I watched Adrian's expression move through several calculations, and I saw the moment he landed on the question, what else does she have? That was the moment I had been building toward for 10 days. Not the injunction, not the letter. This moment, standing across from my son in the basement of my own house, watching him realize that I was not the manageable old woman he had deposited here, that somewhere in the quiet of those days I had been doing something other than accepting my circumstances. This is going to get ugly, he said, and his voice had shifted into a register I recognized from his teenage years. The warning tone, the one that said he was about to do something he knew was wrong, and was preemptively framing it as the other person's fault. It's already ugly, I said. You put your parents in a basement, Adrian. We gave you a comfortable... You put your parents in a basement, I said again, very clearly, and you can call it whatever you want. You can call it a suite or a temporary arrangement or a transition. But that's what you did, and it's on record now, and every day that we're down here is another day that's on record. He stared at me. Then something happened that I had not fully prepared for, even though I should have. Adrian sat down on the bottom step of the staircase, just sat down, like the anger had required a support structure and the structure had given way. He put his elbows on his knees and pressed his hands against his face, and for a long moment he didn't move. Victor, in the recliner, was very still. I watched my son. He dropped his hands. His face was... I don't have a clean word for it. It was the face of someone who is committed to something so fully that they've stopped being able to see it from the outside, and who has just, for one unguarded moment, caught a glimpse of what it looks like from the outside and found it unfamiliar. Lila thought this was the right approach, he said, quietly. Not quite to me, maybe to the room, maybe to himself. Something moved through me. Not sympathy, exactly. Not yet. But the recognition of something I'd known about Adrian since he was young, that he was a man who wanted things he hadn't fully decided he was willing to do the work to get, and that Lila had found that want and given it a vehicle. Lila didn't do this, I said. You did it. You chose it. He looked at me. She had the plan, and you executed it, I said, in this house, against us. That's yours, Adrian. Whatever she suggested, you're the one who walked through that door in a suit with a stack of papers and told your father he didn't have a voice anymore. I let that land. You don't get to put that on Lila. His jaw tightened again. The brief window of something genuine closed. The hardness came back. The injunction won't stop the renovation timeline, he said. It's not an asset freeze. No, I said, but the letter your attorney is going to receive this afternoon regarding the validity of Dr. Greaves's assessment and the formal challenge to the property transfer will create enough of a legal cloud over the title that no contractor will touch this property until it's resolved. I had asked Cross about this specifically, and she had confirmed it specifically, and I had memorized her exact language. That's months, Adrian, at minimum. He stood up. His hands went into his pockets, another gesture I recognized from his teenage years, the posture of someone trying to look less rattled than they are. What do you want? He asked, and his voice had changed again, stripped of the practiced calm, stripped of the managerial distance, just a man asking a question. What is it you actually want out of this? I want my house back, I said. I want your father out of this basement. I want the fraudulent transfer reversed and the assessment challenged and the original deed restored. I paused. And I want you to understand what you did. The last part landed differently than the rest. He flinched just slightly. And if I don't, he started. Then we go through discovery, I said, and everything comes out. The doctor, the timeline, the circumstances under which your father signed documents, and I stopped. I had decided, in consultation with myself over the previous nights, how much to reveal and when. And there are other things about the family history, about the name. I watched his face. Things that would be difficult if they became public. He went very still. What things, he said. That's a conversation for when you're ready to have it honestly, I said. Not now. He looked at me for a long time. His father behind him had not moved or spoken. The basement was very quiet. The space heater hummed its steady hum. I need to talk to Lila, Adrian said finally. I expect you do, I said. He went upstairs. The door closed. Victor let out a slow breath. The name, he said. You told him there were things about the name. I told him there were things, I said. I didn't specify. He'll think you know more than you do. I know exactly what I need to know, I said, and what I know is enough. Victor was quiet for a moment. He'll push back, he said. Adrian doesn't back down easily. He never has. This was true, and I knew it was true, and I had not. I want to be honest, be naive about it. Adrian had not gotten to the position he was in. The arrogance of walking into his parents' house with a stack of papers and a plan, by being the kind of person who reconsidered at the first sign of resistance. He was my son, and I knew him, and I knew that whatever had just happened on those basement stairs, it wasn't a surrender, it was a regrouping. What came next confirmed that. 3 days after the letter, Evelyn Cross called the prepaid phone. I had given Dorothy her number. Dorothy had given it to Cross. The chain was working in the way I had built it to work. And she told me with the precise, unruffled voice I was coming to rely on, that Adrian had retained his own attorney. His name is Gregory Falk, she said. He does estate work. He's competent. A pause. He's also called my office already and suggested, through channels, that your son is willing to discuss he called it a family accommodation. What does that mean? I asked. It means he's scared, Cross said. But he's not ready to concede. So he wants to see if there's a version of this where he gets to keep something. Another pause. He also, and this is interesting, he specifically requested that any discussion be kept private. No media, no public record beyond what's necessary. I thought of the name, the Hale name, the lineage Adrian had spent his professional life referencing. He's worried about what comes out, I said. He's very worried about what comes out, Cross confirmed. Which is good for us, but Mrs. Hale, Falk mentioned that your son is planning something, a family friends, some professional contacts. He's framing it as he called it a family update event, a chance to clarify the situation publicly on his terms before the legal process makes it messier. I absorbed this. He wants to get his story out first. He wants to control the narrative, Cross said. He's going to portray himself as a concerned son making difficult decisions about aging parents who are resisting necessary care. He'll have people there who can speak to his character. He's going to try to make you look irrational, I said, difficult, too emotional to see what's best. Yes, I pressed my hand flat against the cardigan, against the papers inside it. Let him have his gathering, I said, a brief pause from Cross. Marion, I'll be there, I said, and I'll bring what I have. That's a risk, she said carefully. Everything has been a risk, I said, since the first night. I paused. But I know my son, and I know that the worst thing I can do to someone who has spent his whole life managing appearances is make him face the truth in front of the people whose opinion he cares most about. Cross was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality. Not warmer exactly, but with a kind of settled respect in it that hadn't been there at the start of the conversation. I'll be there too, she said. You won't walk in alone. When I told Victor that evening, he sat with it for a long time. The television was on. Another nature documentary. This one about something Arctic, all vast white landscapes and animals that had evolved specifically for survival, and the light from it moved across his face in slow, cold pulses. A public confrontation, he said. Yes. Adrian arranged it thinking it would be on his terms. Yes. And instead, I said, he handed me the room. Victor looked at the television. On the screen, something small and determined was moving across a landscape that should have killed it, moving steadily, without apparent hurry, towards somewhere warmer. When? He said. 2 weeks. He nodded. Then after a moment, I want to be there. Victor, your health, I want her there, he said again, not loud, not desperate, just steady, in the way of a man who has decided something and does not intend to be argued out of it. Whatever happens in that room, he is my son, and whatever I should have said years ago that I didn't say, he stopped. The oxygen tube rose and fell with his breath. I want to say it now, while I still can. I looked at him. This man I had spent 41 years beside, through the good years and the hard years, and the 2 years that had been neither, just grey and quiet and held together by habit and something older than feeling. This man who had kept a secret in a wall for 40 years because he was afraid of what it would do to the people he loved if it came out. He was not a perfect man. He had never been a perfect man, but he was mine, and he wanted to stand up in that room and say what needed to be said, and I was not going to be the one to stop him. All right, I said. He exhaled slowly. Then something crossed his face. That thing again, the almost smile, the one that had been appearing more often since the basement, since the speaking, since the weight of the secret had been shared, and was no longer only his. You know, he said, I used to wonder what it would take. What would take to make you stop being so patient. He looked at me. I used to think nothing could, that you'd just keep absorbing everything forever because that's who you are. A pause. I was wrong. You were, I said. I'm glad, he said. I'm glad I was wrong. The space heater hummed. Above us, footsteps moved across the floor of my house. Lila's step, always slightly heavier on the right, always with that proprietary ease. Planning something probably, on the phone with someone probably, counting something that she was about to discover she'd miscounted. I picked up my notepad. There were 2 weeks before the gathering. I intended to use every single day of them. 2 weeks is a long time when you're living in a basement. It's also a very short time when you're building a case. I used every hour of it. Dorothy came 3 more times in those 2 weeks, always with the cover of friendly visits, always bearing something plausible, a container of soup, a paperback she thought I might enjoy, once a pair of warm socks, because I had mentioned in passing that the basement floor was cold, and she had taken that information and acted on it without being asked, the way that good friends do. Each time she came, she brought something else alongside the visible thing. A printout from the county recorder's website, a note from Cross's office, an update on the investigation into Dr. Greaves. The investigation was moving. Cross had filed a formal complaint with the state medical board regarding Greaves's assessment practices. She had, through careful legal channels, obtained records showing that the same doctor had signed competency assessments in 3 other property transfer cases over the past 4 years, each one resulting in a swift transfer of real estate from an elderly parent to an adult child, each one processed with unusual speed. In one of those cases, the family had settled quietly. In another, the elderly parent had died before contesting anything. In the third, a challenge had been filed but dropped. The parent, a 78-year-old man, had been too exhausted by the process to continue. That third case made me angrier than almost anything else in this entire story. Not at Greaves specifically, not even at Adrian, at the system that made exhaustion a viable legal strategy, at the people who understood that if you make something hard enough for long enough, most people will simply stop fighting. I was not going to stop fighting. The county records, which Dorothy obtained through a simple public records request. Nothing dramatic, nothing legally complex, just a woman filling out a form at the county recorder's office, which anyone can do. Showed the property transfer had been filed on a Tuesday morning, 9 days before Adrian and Lila had walked into my house with that stack of papers, which meant the paperwork had been processed, the title changed, the whole legal maneuver completed while Adrian was still sitting at my kitchen table, drinking the dark roast coffee I kept stocked for him in my pantry, and letting me believe he was visiting because he cared. 9 days. He had been sitting across from me at my table for 9 days after that transfer was done, and he had looked me in the eye and eaten my food and said nothing. I wrote that date down in my notepad and circled it twice. During those 2 weeks, something else happened that I hadn't anticipated, which is that I began to understand my son better than I ever had when we were living in the same house as ordinary family. When you observe someone from a position they think is powerless, you see them differently. You see the gaps between what they say and how they say it. You hear the conversations they have on the other side of the ceiling, with a clarity that closeness somehow prevents. What I learned was this. Adrian was not a confident man executing a clean plan. He was a frightened man executing a messy one and working very hard to make it look clean. The suit was performance. The brisk efficiency was performance. Even the Saturday morning when he came downstairs and talked about the kitchen renovation with something approaching enthusiasm. That was performance. The performance of a man who needed to believe he was doing a reasonable thing and kept requiring an audience to confirm it. Lila was the engine. I had known this, but 2 weeks in a basement confirmed it in ways I couldn't ignore. It was Lila who made the calls. Lila, who I heard on the phone with the contractor, the attorney, someone at a title company whose name I couldn't catch. It was Lila who came to the top of the basement stairs once and called down to ask if Victor needed his prescription refilled, with the tone of a property manager inquiring about a tenant's maintenance requests. It was Lila who had the folder, who had the clipboard, who had walked into the room on that first night and immediately began assessing the square footage. Adrian had wanted something. Lila had built a vehicle to get it, and Adrian had gotten in and let her drive. And I think, this is my honest read of my own son, for whatever it's worth, that somewhere in those 2 weeks he had begun to understand that he was much further from shore than he'd realized when he stepped into the water. He never said that. He would not have said it, but I heard it in the slight increase in silence when he came downstairs. In the way he'd started lingering a few extra seconds at the bottom of the stairs before going back up, as if giving himself time to say something he couldn't find the words for. In the way he looked at his father once, just once, a quick look while he thought I wasn't watching, with something raw in it that neither of them acknowledged. Victor saw it too. He didn't say anything about it to me. But I saw him see it, and I let it be what it was, because there are some things between fathers and sons that a mother's presence only complicates. The morning of the gathering, I woke at 5, not because I'd set anything, there was nothing to set, but because my body understood the day's weight before my mind had fully caught up with it. I lay on the cot in the grey pre-dawn and went through everything once more, the way an actor runs lines before a performance, not because the words aren't memorized, but because saying them one more time makes them feel less like words and more like truth. The forged transfer, the filing date, the 9 days, Dr. Greaves and his pattern, the notary stamp, the original deed which Cross had tracked down in the county records and had a certified copy of. The original will, Victor's, drawn up 15 years ago by a legitimate estate attorney with no connection to Gregory Falk or anyone in Adrian's orbit, which left the property jointly to me and specified clear conditions for any transfer during Victor's lifetime. And underneath all of that, in the cardigan, the documents from behind the brick, Victor's adoption records, the biological family, the history of the name. I had thought carefully about whether to use them. I had gone back and forth on it in the long quiet nights. Whether bringing them into a public setting crossed a line I wasn't willing to cross, whether there was a version of this fight that could be won without dismantling something my husband had carried privately for 40 years. I had decided, finally, that the decision wasn't mine alone, and I had asked Victor. We'd had that conversation 3 nights before the gathering in the low light of the basement lamp, with the space heater humming and the house quiet above us. I had laid it out plainly, not dramatically, not with any attempt to manage his response, just the honest question, do you want this to come out? He had been quiet for a long time. Then he'd said, the name was never what he thought it was. That's not my fault and it's not his. But he used it to build something dishonest. And if the truth of it is what stops him, he paused, then the truth is what we use. So the papers stayed in the cardigan. Evelyn Cross arrived at my house, though the legal status of that designation was still pending, at 9 in the morning on the day of the gathering. She came to the front door. She knocked. I heard the knock from the basement, and I heard Adrian's voice, surprised, and then Cross's voice, and then a brief tense silence, and then the sound of the door opening wider. She came downstairs herself, Adrian behind her, jaw tight, eyes going between her and me with a recalculating look. Mrs. Hale, Cross said. She looked, as always, completely unruffled. Dark blazer, the same kind of compact, unhurried presence she'd had in her office. Are you ready? Yes, I said. I stood up from the table. I straightened my cardigan. The motion had become a ritual by now. The check of the pocket, the press of my hand against the papers inside. I looked at Victor. He was already dressed. He had put on the good shirt, a dark blue one that I had ironed for him 3 days earlier, running the travel iron Dorothy had brought on one of her visits over the collar and cuffs, with the particular care you give to things that matter. He looked thinner than he should in it. But he was upright, and his eyes were clear, and when I looked at him he gave me one of those small fractional nods that in 41 years of marriage had come to mean something more than any longer gesture. I'm with you. "He needs the elevator," I said to Adrian. Flat, not a request. Adrian looked at his father. Something moved across his face. "The lift isn't." "Then you help him up the stairs," Cross said, in the same tone she might use to note a clerical error. "Because he's attending." Adrian looked at her, then at his father, then back at me. I watched him do the math of what refusing would look like, what it would mean if it came up later in a legal context, what the room upstairs would see if an old man in a good shirt had to be physically prevented from attending his own family gathering. "Fine," he said, not graciously, just done fighting that particular battle. It took time to get Victor upstairs. It took Adrian and one of the neighbors Adrian had recruited to help set up the gathering. A man named Phil Kowalski, who'd been mowing my lawn for 6 years and who looked at me when I came up through the basement door with an expression that said he was filing away what he was seeing for later consideration. Taking Victor carefully up the stairs while I followed with the oxygen tank and Cross followed behind me, which I noticed and appreciated the geometry of it, the way she positioned herself as a presence at my back, without ever making it theatrical. The living room had been rearranged. This hit me harder than I expected. Not the people, there were perhaps 20 of them, gathered in that particular awkward standing cluster of people waiting for something to officially begin, but the furniture. My furniture moved, the armchairs repositioned. The side table where Victor always set his coffee cup had been pushed against the wall to make room for a row of chairs facing a clear space at the front of the room, like a small courtroom, like something arranged for a presentation, which I supposed it was. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors, a couple I vaguely knew from Adrian's professional circle. Victor's brother Gerald, who lived 2 hours away, and who looked at me when I entered with the alarmed, slightly guilty face of a man who had accepted the invitation to an event and was now beginning to understand what kind of event he'd accepted. And I saw in the back corner a woman I didn't recognize. 50s, professional clothes, a small recorder on the table beside her, a journalist, Cross confirmed in a low voice near my ear. "He invited a journalist," she said, "local paper. He wanted the story covered." "Good," I said. Cross glanced at me sideways. "Good," I said again. Adrian was at the front of the room, Lila beside him, and the difference from that first night, the suits, the clipboard, the practice confidence, was that some of the practice part had worn off. She was still put together, still precise, but there was a tension in her jaw that I recognized as the tension of someone holding a story together through force of will and hoping no one looks too closely at the seams. Adrian called the room to order with the carefully calibrated tone of a man who wants to seem reluctant to be doing this but knows he has to. He thanked everyone for coming. He spoke about his parents' situation with the language of concern. Declining health, difficult decisions, the responsibility of family. He said he and Lila had made choices that hadn't been easy, but that they believed were in everyone's best interests. He said that some legal challenges had been filed, and he wanted to address those here, honestly, in front of people who knew the family, because he valued transparency. Transparency, he used that word. I let him finish. I sat in the chair Victor and I had been given near the side wall. Not center, not prominent, the positioning of people who are being managed. With my hands folded in my lap and my face arranged in the attentive, neutral expression of someone who is listening carefully and has not yet decided what to do with what they're hearing. Cross sat beside me. Victor sat on my other side, the oxygen tank between his feet, breathing carefully. When Adrian finished, he opened the floor. He said he wanted this to be a conversation, not a lecture, and that his parents were welcome to share their perspective in their own living room with rearranged furniture. "Thank you," I said. I stood up. "I will." The room settled. I had not, until I was standing, been sure how many people were looking at me. Now I felt the full weight of it. 20 faces, various mixtures of discomfort and curiosity, and the particular social anxiety of people who have walked into a situation more serious than they'd anticipated. The journalist in the corner had her recorder running. Good. I want to start with a date, I said. October 9th. That's the date the property transfer for this house was filed at the county recorder's office. I paused. 9 days before my son came to this house with that paperwork and told both of us, that things were being restructured. I looked around the room. 9 days. The house was already transferred before he sat at my kitchen table that evening, before he told me to be reasonable, before he had my husband help down into our basement. The room was very quiet. Adrian's face had gone careful, controlled. There's context. I'm giving the context, I said, gently, not combatively. I had specifically decided not to be combative, because combative is what he'd prepared for, and calm was what he hadn't. The transfer was executed using a competency assessment signed by a Dr. Philip Greaves. That assessment declared my husband cognitively impaired and unable to make sound decisions about property. I reached into the folder Cross had given me, the certified copies organized in the order we had agreed on, and withdrew the first document. Dr. Greaves has performed the same assessment in 3 other documented cases over the past 4 years. All 3 resulted in property transfers. The State Medical Board has opened an inquiry. I set the document on the side table, calmly, like I was setting down a serving dish. That's in the paperwork. Gerald, Victor's brother, in the back of the room, shifted heavily in his seat. This isn't... Lila started. The original deed for this property, I said, withdrawing the second document, was drawn up 22 years ago. My name is on it. My husband's name is on it. The deed specifies conditions for any transfer during Victor's lifetime. Those conditions were not met. Another document set on the table. That's also in the paperwork. Mom, Adrian's voice had an edge now, the warning tone, the one I'd heard all his life. This is not the right forum. So you chose the forum, I said. You invited these people. You invited her. I glanced at the journalist. You wanted the story told publicly. I'm telling it publicly. The room had the quality of a held breath. Phil Kowalski, the neighbor with the lawnmower, was staring at Adrian with an expression that had moved from discomfort into something more like reckoning. I let the moment breathe. Then I looked at my son. Adrian, I said, I have one more thing, and I want you to know before I say it that I take no pleasure in it. That's not what this is. He stared at me. His jaw was tight. Beside him, Lila had gone very still with the precise stillness of an animal that has identified a threat and is calculating. Victor, I said, do you want to say it or should I? Victor had been sitting very quietly, but he looked up at the sound of his name, and when he spoke, the room turned toward him with the instinctive attention that people give to someone who is clearly making an effort to be heard. The Hale name, Victor said, his voice was rough but steady, is not a bloodline. It was given to me by the people who adopted me as an infant. He looked at his son. I was not born a Hale. I was made one. By 2 good people who gave me everything I have. He paused. Including this house, which I built for your mother, which has her name on the deed, which you took from her. The silence in the room was total. The family I was born into, Victor continued, had a different history, one I was protected from knowing as a child, one I found out about when I was 29. He looked at Adrian steadily. I should have told you. That was my failure. But the name you have built your life on, it isn't an inheritance, it's a gift. From people who chose to love me. A pause. You didn't choose love, Adrian. You chose a transaction. Adrian's face had gone through several colors in the span of 30 seconds. The professional colleagues he'd invited, 2 of them, a man and a woman, who I vaguely understood, were people whose opinions he valued in business contexts. We're looking at each other with the careful blankness of people who are very busy deciding what they haven't heard. That's not, Adrian started. His voice cracked on the first word. He cleared his throat. Dad, that doesn't change the legal record, Cross said, standing now beside me, her voice carrying the clear, authoritative timbre of someone entirely comfortable in rooms like this. Currently shows a fraudulent property transfer, an improperly executed competency assessment from a physician under active inquiry, and a deed violation. What you do with that in the next 24 hours will determine whether this resolves privately or in open court, where all of this, she gestured at the room, becomes part of a public filing. Lila moved. Quick, a slight step forward, and in her face, for the first time, the very first time, I saw something I hadn't expected from her. Fear, not the calculated readjustment I'd seen when the injunction letter arrived, not the tight control she'd maintained throughout. Actual, unmanaged fear, the kind that comes when you realize that the thing you've been constructing has load-bearing walls you didn't know about, and those walls are going. Adrian, she said. Her voice had a quality it hadn't had before, lower, less certain. We should. I know, he said. He cut her off, which, in 6 years of watching them together, I had never seen him do. He looked at the room. He looked at the people he'd invited, the colleagues, the neighbors, Gerald, who was now looking at his shoes, the journalist with the recorder running. And I watched something in him do what I can only describe as collapse. Not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical breakdown that this kind of story tends to get in the retelling. Just a quiet interior giving way, like a structure that's been under too much pressure for too long and finally stops pretending it can hold. He looked at me. The attorney, he said, not loudly, almost quietly enough that only I could hear it. What does she need? A meeting, I said, this week. Her, your attorney, you and me. I paused. And the reversal paperwork, drawn up and ready to sign. His jaw worked. Lila, this is your decision, I said. Whatever she told you to do, whatever the plan was, this part is yours. He stood there for a moment. In the living room of the house he had grown up in front of the people whose respect he had organized his entire life around maintaining, with the record running in the corner and his parents standing in front of him, and the floor of the identity he'd built crumbling in real time beneath his feet. And then, this is the part I find hardest to write, not because of what it cost me, but because of what it shows about how much had been lost long before any of this happened. He turned to his wife, not to his father, not to me, to Lila, and she looked back at him with that recalibrated, assessing gaze, and whatever passed between them in that look was something I will never fully know. But what came out of it was Lila giving one small, stiff nod, and Adrian looking back at me and saying, set the meeting. The room exhaled, not all at once, gradually, in the way of people who have been holding themselves very carefully and are now permitted to stop. Phil Kowalski said something to the person next to him in a low voice. Gerald stood up and walked toward Victor without saying anything, just walked up to his brother and put a hand on his shoulder, and Victor covered that hand with his own. The two professional colleagues were already moving toward the door with the fluid, practiced ease of people experienced at removing themselves from situations that could compromise them. Lila turned away from the room and walked to the window. She stood there with her back to everyone, looking out at the garden, the bare tulip beds, the patchy November grass, the place where I had spent 32 years of my life making something grow. And I couldn't see her face from where I stood, but I could see the set of her shoulders, the particular rigidity of someone who has not admitted defeat and is not going to, but who has understood finally that the thing they came for is not going to be theirs. The journalist in the corner was writing something. Cross came and stood beside me. She didn't say anything immediately. She just stood there, which was the right thing to do. After a moment, she said quietly, "You did well." "Victor did well," I said. "Both of you," she said, "equally." I looked at my husband, who was still sitting with Gerald's hand on his shoulder, talking in the low, private way of brothers who have been a long time without a real conversation. He looked tired, deeply, structurally tired, the kind that goes past sleep. But there was something in his face that had not been there in the basement, not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Peace, maybe. A small, hard-won piece of it. Lila left the house before anyone else. She went upstairs first. I heard her footsteps, quick and deliberate, and came back down with a bag. A weekend bag, the kind that lives in a closet, already half-packed, for the kind of woman who is always slightly ready to leave. She walked through the living room without looking at me, without looking at Adrian, without looking at anyone, and she went out the front door, and the door closed behind her with a click that sounded in the silence, very final. Adrian watched her go. He didn't follow. He stood in the middle of the rearranged living room with his hands at his sides and his face doing something complicated that I had no language for, and I stood across the room and watched him. And I thought about the baby I had held in a hospital room 43 years ago, and the boy whose nightmares I had sat beside, and the man who had walked into this room in a suit with a plan, and discovered the hard way what the plan had actually been built on. "What happens now?" he said. He was looking at the floor, not at me. "You call Gregory Falk today," I said. "You tell him to set the meeting with Cross. You don't delay it, don't reschedule it, don't look for other angles." I paused. "And you take those chairs and you put my furniture back where it was." He looked up. "The armchairs," I said, "the side table, put them back." He stared at me for a moment. Then, without a word, he walked to the nearest armchair, the one that had been my mother's, that I had reupholstered twice in 30 years and would reupholster again before I'd let it go. And he moved it back to where it belonged, by the window. It was not an apology. I want to be clear about that. It was not a beginning of healing or a turning point in our relationship or any of the other things that stories like this are supposed to contain. It was a man moving furniture because his mother told him to, but he did it. And I watched him do it, and I let that be what it was. The meeting with the attorneys happened 4 days later in Cross's office, in the room with the high bank ceilings and the warm wood furniture. Falk was there, a grey-haired man with the polished, slightly defensive manner of someone who had begun to understand that his client's position was weaker than he'd been told when he took the case. Adrian sat across the conference table from me. He did not bring Lila. The reversal paperwork was drawn up. Cross had negotiated its terms over the preceding days with a precision that I had found, at times, almost frightening to witness. She was the kind of attorney who had thought 11 steps ahead and was only showing you step 3, which meant that by the time Falk understood what step 3 had committed his client to, steps 4 through 11 were already in motion. The result was this: the property transfer was formally reversed. The deed was restored to its original status. My name, Victor's name, jointly held. The family trust Adrian had established was dissolved. Dr. Greaves's involvement was referred to the medical board for full review, which meant his pattern of assessments would face scrutiny regardless of what Adrian chose to do privately. Adrian signed. His pen moved across the page with a kind of controlled blankness, the signature of a man who has decided that the specific feeling of this moment is not something he is going to allow himself to have right now, and may not allow himself to have ever. When it was done, Cross collected the papers and stacked them with the quiet efficiency of someone closing a file. Falk gathered his things. The room had the particular stillness of an ending. Adrian sat for a moment without moving. Then he looked at me across the table. "The name," he said, "what you said, what Dad said." He paused. "Is all of that in the legal record now?" "The competency fraud is," I said. "The adoption records? No. That was between us, between this family." He looked at the table. "I built a lot of things on that name." "I know you did. Everything I thought I came from." "You came from us," I said. from Victor and me, from this house that was always real. I paused. The rest was a story you told yourself, and maybe we should have told you a different one sooner. But what you did with the story, that wasn't the story's fault. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he did speak, it was very quiet. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if you can, I said honestly. Not quickly, not easily. I looked at my hands on the table. The arthritic fingers, the garden calluses, the thin gold wedding band I had worn for 41 years. But you start by not making it worse, and then you figure out the rest. He nodded once, and then he stood up and he put on his coat and he left the office. I sat in the chair for a moment after he was gone. Cross was at her desk making notes, giving me the space of not looking at me, which was a kindness I hadn't asked for but appreciated. Outside the high bank windows, the November sky was the flat white of overcast days. The kind of sky that's neither beautiful nor dramatic, just present. The ordinary sky of an ordinary day on the other side of something that was not ordinary at all. I pressed my hand against my cardigan. The papers were still there. Victor's history, his secret, the thing he'd kept behind a brick for nearly 40 years. I thought about what to do with them. Not the legal record, those questions were resolved. I mean the documents themselves, the physical papers in the plastic bag, the birth records and the investigator's report, and the truth of where Victor came from before he was Victor. I thought, they belonged to him. They always belonged to him. And when I got home, when I walked through the front door of my own house for the first time in over 3 weeks, which is an experience I am not going to attempt to fully describe because there are no adequate words for the particular weight of returning to something that should never have been taken, I would give them back to him. And we would decide together what to do next. That, I had learned, was the only way to do anything. Together. Coming home is supposed to feel like something clean. That's what you imagine when you're in a basement for 3 weeks planning and waiting and holding yourself together with stubbornness and safety pins. You imagine that the moment you walk back through the front door, something inside you will release. Some knot you've been carrying will loosen. The house will feel like yours again immediately and completely, the way it did before any of this happened. It didn't work that way. When Cross dropped me off that afternoon, after the signing, after Adrian had left the conference room and the paperwork had been collected and everything that needed to be legally done had been done, I stood on my own front porch for a moment before going in, just stood there. The door was in front of me. My key was in my hand, my actual key, which Cross had arranged to be returned as part of the settlement terms. The deadbolt turned the same way it always had. The door swung open on the same slightly too wide arc that it always had, because the bottom hinge had been slightly loose for 6 years and Victor kept meaning to fix it and never quite did. Everything was the same, and I stood in my own hallway and felt absolutely nothing like myself. The furniture was back in place. Adrian had moved it all before he left, which had taken him the better part of 2 hours alone, in a house where he was now very much a guest and not an owner. The armchairs were where they belonged. The side table was back beside the window. The kitchen smelled faintly of someone else's cooking. Something with garlic. Something I hadn't made. Which was the clearest evidence of 3 weeks of occupation, that smell, more than anything legal or documented or formally recorded. Victor was already upstairs. Gerald had driven him home from the attorney's office before me, and when I came through the door, I could hear the oxygen tank from the hallway, that familiar soft hiss and the sound of the television. The nature documentary channel, of course. I stood in the hallway for another moment, then I went to the kitchen, filled the kettle and made tea. Not because I wanted tea, because making tea was mine. The ritual of it, the specific motion of filling the kettle at the sink with the east-facing window above it, the window I had specifically requested when we built this place because I liked the morning light. Standing at that sink, running the water, watching the sky through that window. It was such a small, ordinary thing. It was exactly what I needed. I carried 2 cups upstairs. Victor was in the bedroom, in the bed for once rather than the recliner, which told me the day had taken more from him than he'd let show. He looked up when I came in, his face when he saw me coming through the bedroom door of our bedroom in our house, with 2 cups of tea and grass stains still faintly visible on the knees of my trousers from the morning I'd gone out the basement window, did something complicated that I didn't try to name. "How'd it go?" he said. "He signed," I said. I set his cup on the nightstand. "It's done." He nodded. A long, slow exhale. "The house is ours," I said. "Both our names, exactly as it was." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at me. "Sit down, Marion." I sat on the edge of the bed, my side, the left side, the one I had slept on for 31 years in this room, and held my tea with both hands, and the two of us were quiet in the way we had been quiet together, at our best, for 4 decades. Not the quiet of people who have nothing to say, the quiet of people who have said enough for now, and are simply resting in each other's presence. After a while he said, "I need to tell you something." I looked at him. "Not another secret," he said quickly, reading my face. Nothing hidden, just," he paused. "I've been thinking down there these past weeks about what I should have done differently. Not with the house, not the legal things, about us, about the things I let go too long without saying. Victor, let me," he said, "please." I let him. He talked for a while, not in the way of a man making a speech or performing a confession, but in the halting, honest way of someone who has spent a long time being private and is now, at significant personal cost, choosing to be less so. He talked about the secret, not just the fact of it, but the weight of it, what it had been like to carry something that size for nearly 40 years. He talked about the fear underneath the silence, fear that if Adrian knew the truth about the name, it would take something from him that couldn't be replaced. Fear that if I knew Victor's origins, it would change how I saw him. Fear that the story of his own life, which he had been handed and then had built carefully over decades, would come apart. "You should have told me," I said, not angrily, just clearly. "I know. I would have. I know what you would have done," he said. "That's partly why I didn't, because you would have handled it so well, and I wasn't ready to be the one who needed handling." I sat with that for a moment. It was the most honestly he had spoken to me in years, maybe in a decade, and the honesty of it required something from me too. The acknowledgement that I had not always made it easy for him to be uncertain, that my habit of managing things had sometimes crowded out the space for him to be the one who didn't have the answer. "We've been very good at taking care of everything," I said, "and not always very good at taking care of each other." He looked at me. "Yes." "We can do better," I said. "I'm not sure how much time we have to do better," he said. Not bitterly, just factually, with the precision of a man who had been receiving medical reports for 3 years and knew how to read them. "Then we don't waste it," I said. He reached over and covered my hand with his. Those aged hands, the thin skin, the prominent veins, the thick knuckles, the hands that had built furniture and changed diapers and gripped mine through everything. I turned my hand over and held his properly, the way you hold something you know you're going to have to let go of eventually and are not yet ready to. We stayed like that for a long time. The weeks that followed the settlement were not, I want to be honest, easy. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that arrives after a crisis is resolved. Not during, when your body is running on purpose and necessity, but after, when the emergency is over and your nervous system finally gets to report on what the past month has actually cost you. I slept for 12 hours the first 2 nights back in my own bed. My hip, which I had been managing through willpower and stubbornness, staged a formal protest that kept me moving slowly for almost 2 weeks. My arthritic fingers, which had gripped pens and papers and brick edges and window frames under conditions they were not designed for, ached badly enough some mornings that I had to run them under warm water for 10 minutes before they were useful. The house needed attention too. 3 weeks of other people living in it had left a residue that wasn't exactly damage, nothing broken, nothing destroyed, but a kind of overlay of wrongness, different things in different places. A smell in the guest room I didn't recognize. A coffee ring on the kitchen counter from a cup that hadn't been mine. Small enough things individually. Together they amounted to the sensation of a place that had been briefly inhabited by strangers and needed time to remember what it was. I cleaned for 4 days. Not frantically, methodically, the way I do things, room by room, starting from the top of the house and working down. Dorothy came and helped for 2 of those days, and we worked side by side without talking very much, which was exactly right, because sometimes the most useful thing a friendship can do is just show up with a mop and not require anything from you. I did not go to the basement, not those first days. I walked past the door to it, with the deliberate non-engagement of someone who is not ready yet, and I gave myself permission to not be ready yet, because I had spent the past month telling myself to be strong and capable and strategic, and I was tired of all of that, and I needed, for a little while, to simply not be ready for something without apologizing for it. Dorothy noticed in the way she noticed everything. On the second day, when we were taking a break for coffee in the kitchen, she said carefully, "Have you been down?" "Not yet," I said. She nodded, drank her coffee, said nothing else about it. I loved her for that too. Adrian called on the 5th day. The phone rang. My actual phone, which had been returned as part of the settlement terms, still with all its contacts and photos intact, which I had specifically required, because among those photos were 40 years of my life, and I was not about to lose them to spite. And when I saw his name on the screen, my hand did a thing it hadn't done since the whole ordeal began. It shook, not badly, just a small, involuntary tremor, the body registering something the mind was trying to handle calmly. I let it ring 3 times. Then I answered. "Mom," he said. "Adrian." A long pause, the kind of pause that has a great deal in it. Apology maybe, or the attempt at apology, or at least the recognition that apology is what the moment calls for, and the uncertainty of how to begin. I wanted to... He stopped, started again. "Lila and I are separating. I had expected this." I had not expected to feel anything in particular about it, but I did feel something. Not satisfaction, which would have been the wrong thing to feel, but a kind of low, sad recognition. Of course they were. The plan had been built for 2, and it had failed for 2, and failure of that magnitude has a way of revealing exactly what the structure was made of underneath the ambition. "I'm sorry," I said. And I meant it in the complicated way you mean things that are true and painful simultaneously. "Are you?" He said it without accusation, genuinely asking. "Yes," and I said, "I know that might be hard to believe, but I am." I paused. I didn't want this, Adrian, any of it. I wanted a son who didn't need to take things from us. I wanted to not have to fight you. He was quiet for a moment. "I know." "Do you?" "I think so," he said. "I think I'm starting to." Another pause. "I need to talk to Dad when it's a good time." "I'll ask him," I said. "He'll want to. I believe that." "Okay." His voice had a quality to it that I hadn't heard from him in a very long time. Stripped of the performance, the brisk professionalism, the careful self-presentation, just a man's voice, a tired one. "Mom, I can't tell you I understood what I was doing while I was doing it. That sounds like an excuse. Maybe it is one. But I genuinely thought..." "I know what you thought," I said. "You thought we needed managing. You thought you were being responsible." I kept my voice even. "But there's a difference between responsibility and control, and somewhere you stopped knowing the difference." He didn't argue. That was something. "The name," he said. "What Dad told me about the adoption, the family history." A pause. "I've been thinking about it a lot. And I spent 40 years being proud of something that wasn't what I thought it was," he said. "And I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it right now," I said. "But eventually you have to figure out what you're proud of that's actually yours. What you built, what you did." I paused. "Not what you inherited, not what you borrowed." He was quiet for a long time. "That's harder," he said. "Yes," I said, "it is." We didn't resolve anything on that call. We weren't supposed to. Resolution, the real kind, is not a conversation. It's a practice. Something you do over and over, imperfectly, making mistakes and correcting them and making different mistakes and continuing anyway. I had no illusions about what the road between where we were and anything resembling repair looked like. It was long and without a guaranteed endpoint, and involved two people who had hurt each other in ways that don't simply get filed away and forgotten. But he called. He told me the truth. He asked about his father. I held on to that. It was a Saturday in December when I finally went to the basement. I had been putting it off for almost 3 weeks. Not consciously, or not entirely consciously. I would find other things to do, other parts of the house to attend to, other reasons to be elsewhere. But that Saturday morning, Victor was having a better day than usual, more alert, eating a real breakfast, watching his documentaries with genuine engagement, rather than the distracted half attention of a man whose energy is elsewhere. And something in the quality of the morning felt like the right time. I went down. The step stool was still behind the paint cans where I'd left it because the men with the dolly had not, apparently, been instructed to catalogue the workbench. The folding table was still there, though collapsed now and leaning against the wall. The cot was gone. Adrian had had it removed at some point, which I was fine with because I had no desire to preserve the particular geometry of how those weeks had been arranged. The spacey heater was still in the corner, unplugged. I stood in the middle of the basement and looked around at it. It was just a basement. That sounds obvious, but it needed to be felt. It was concrete and brick and low ceiling and east wall, with the workbench and the loose brick that was no longer loose. I had repacked it, sealed it. There was nothing behind it now. It was the space it had always been, the one where Victor had built furniture and I had stored garden tools, and the holiday boxes had lived in labelled stacks along the south wall. It was a room where bad things had happened. It was also still just a room. I have thought about this a great deal in the months since, about the nature of places that carry bad things, about whether it's possible to stay in a house where something like this happened, whether the rooms remember, whether you can walk through your own kitchen every morning, knowing that 3 weeks after the paperwork went through, you were locked in the space below it. The answer I came to was, it depends on what you do with the rooms. I dragged the folding table out to the trash. I dismantled the shelf they had put up along the south wall. Adrian and the men with the dolly, the makeshift medicine shelf, and I put the bricks back in the proper order and painted over the marks the shelf brackets had left, a specific shade of cream that matched the rest of the basement walls, which I had to mix myself because I'd run out of the original and couldn't match it precisely from the hardware store. So the patch is still slightly lighter than the surrounding wall. A small imperfection. I left it. Then I brought down the first box. I want to say it was a grand plan from the beginning, a vision of transformation, the kind of deliberate reclamation that makes a clean narrative. It wasn't. It started with a single box of papers, old letters, photographs, documents from the first years of our marriage that I had been meaning to organize for years and hadn't. I brought them down because the light in the basement was actually good in the mornings, better than I'd ever really paid attention to, and the space was quiet in a way the rest of the house wasn't. I sat at a new table I bought from a second-hand furniture shop downtown, solid oak, smaller than a desk but sturdier than the folding thing, and I started organizing. The letters from the early years. Victor's handwriting when he was young, before age had changed it. Smaller, faster, slanting slightly right. My own handwriting from the same period, which I barely recognize, rounder and more uncertain than what it became. Letters we'd sent each other during a 3-month period when I'd gone back to care for my mother, and Victor had been home, and we'd been the kind of young married that still wrote letters because it was what you did, because the distance required something more substantial than a phone call. I hadn't read these in 20 years. I read them in the basement at the oak table, in the December morning light coming through the east window, and what struck me was not the youth of the writing or the smallness of the concerns. This was before the children, before the miscarriages, before the hard years, before any of it, but the recognition in it, the way we talk to each other, the specific texture of two people who were still figuring out how to be together and were doing it honestly, without performance, without the accumulated habits that decades build. We had been good then. We had been real with each other. We could be again. Less time, fewer illusions, but real. I brought the letters upstairs that evening and read some of them aloud to Victor. He listened with his eyes closed, which was how he listened to things he wanted to pay attention to, and occasionally he'd say, "Oh, I remember that," or "Did I really say that?" And once he laughed, a real laugh, which had become rare enough that the sound of it caught me off guard, and I had to stop reading for a moment. "We were ridiculous," he said. "We were 26, I said. "Same thing," he said, and then quietly, "Read that one again, the one about the rain." I read it again. Victor's decline was not dramatic in the way that stories tend to make decline dramatic. There was no single moment where everything changed. There were gradual changes, energy levels dropping, the oxygen dependency increasing, the appetite narrowing down to smaller and simpler things. There were better weeks and worse weeks. There were mornings where he sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee and talked about the garden plans I'd described to him, what I was thinking of planting in the spring, whether to move the tulip beds, with genuine engagement and interest. And there were days where getting from the bedroom to the kitchen was enough. I had stopped pretending that this was not what it was. That too, I think, was something the basement had done for me. Something about having faced a thing that was real and terrible and refusing to look away from it had made me less willing to look away from other things that were real and hard. Victor was dying. I knew that. He knew that. We had known it for 2 years in the abstract way. You know things you're not ready to hold fully. And now we were holding it. It was not, as I had feared, unbearable. It was painful in ways that I cannot fully describe and would not try to. But it was also the most honest we had been with each other in years. In some ways, in the last months, in the way grief sometimes works, it was the closest we had been. He asked to see Adrian in February. Just once, the two of them alone. I left them in the living room for 2 hours and went to Dorothy's house and drank tea, and did not ask afterward what was said. Victor didn't volunteer it in detail, and I didn't press. What I saw in his face afterward was something that had not fully been there before. Not resolution, exactly. More like a closed drawer. Something put away properly instead of left open. Adrian looked, when he left the house that afternoon, like he'd been taken apart and was carrying himself very carefully so as not to drop any pieces. Good. That was what it should feel like. Not cruelty, just the appropriate weight of a thing. The medical board's investigation into Dr. Greaves concluded in March. His license was suspended pending further review, and 3 of the 4 families in the documented pattern, including mine, received formal letters of apology from the board. The apology letter arrived on a Tuesday, and I read it at the kitchen table with the east window light coming in the way it always did, and I felt, not vindication exactly, which is too clean a word, more like the particular satisfaction of a bureaucratic confirmation of something you already knew to be true. I put the letter in the archive. That's what I came to call it by spring. The archive. The basement had been reorganized over those months into something I had not planned, but had arrived at organically. Not a storage space, not the managed helplessness of those 3 weeks, but a proper personal archive. Boxes organized by decade. Photographs in archival sleeves. Victor's adoption papers returned to him, and then, with his permission, filed in a properly labeled folder, along with his parents. His adoptive parents, the ones who had loved him and given him everything, photographs and letters, the whole story, organized, not hidden, just kept. I worked on it in the mornings usually, the east window, the oak table, the quiet. Sometimes Victor came down in the afternoons, on better days, and sat in the one comfortable chair I'd put in the corner. I'd found a good reading chair at the same second-hand shop, worn leather, the kind that has been sat in enough to know what sitting is. And he would look at what I was working on and occasionally say, "Oh, keep that one," or "I didn't know you had that." We talked in those afternoons, really talked, about the early years, about the hard years, about things we had never said directly, and things we had said badly, and things we should have asked about and hadn't. It was not easy conversation. It was not the comfortable retrospective warmth of happy old age. It was two people who had been through something real together, who had imperfect histories with each other, who had hurt each other in the quiet ways that long marriages accumulate, and who had decided, with what time was left, with the clock fully visible and ticking, to be honest. It was the best thing we did. I want you to know that. Whatever else happened, those mornings and afternoons in the house, with the east window and the archive and Victor in the reading chair, were the best thing that came out of any of this. Not because they were easy, because they were real. Victor died on a Thursday in April. I'm going to tell you that plainly because he would have wanted it told plainly. He was not a man for melodrama, despite having spent the last year of his life in a situation that qualified. He died at home, in our bedroom in the early morning, with me beside him and the oxygen tank doing its last inadequate work and the particular quality of April light coming through the curtains. He had been declining faster in the final 2 weeks, and the hospice nurse had told me, gently and without false comfort, what the signs meant. So I was not shocked. I was not blindsided. I was heartbroken in the specific, private way of someone who has known a thing was coming and discovers that knowing it does not diminish it. I held his hand. I don't want to write more about this than that because some things belong entirely to the people inside them. Dorothy came that morning. Adrian came that afternoon. He looked at the door like he wasn't sure we had the right to be there, and I stepped back and let him in because whatever had happened between us, Victor was his father, and grief is not a reward you earn by having been good enough. It's just grief. I let him have it. He stood beside the bed for a long time. He didn't speak. When he turned to leave, he stopped in the doorway and looked at me. He told me, he said, in February, he told me he was proud of you. Not what you did, who you are. A pause. He said he'd always been proud of you, that he hadn't said it enough. I didn't say anything. I wanted you to know, Adrian said. He left. The house was quiet again. I sat in the kitchen for a while with the east window and no particular thought in my head, which was not emptiness but more like the aftermath of something so full that the space after it requires time to settle. Then I went downstairs. I sat at the oak table in the archive. Around me, in labeled boxes, in organized folders, in archival sleeves, was the collected material of a life built with someone. Not a perfect life, not a simple one, a life with secrets kept too long and things unsaid, and 2 years of grey distance and one very bad month in a basement, and then, in the end, the months of honesty that had been more valuable than all the comfortable years combined. I sat there for a long time, and then I opened a new folder, a blank one. I had bought a set of them from the office supply store downtown, the kind with the 2-pronged fastener in the middle, and I had been using them for the decade boxes. I opened a new one and I put 2 things in it. The first was the copy of the reverse deed. My name, Victor's name, jointly held as it should always have been. The second was the letter Victor had written me sometime in that last year, which I had found in his nightstand drawer after he passed, folded in thirds, with my name on the outside in his handwriting, rounder now and slower, nothing like the fast slanting letters of his youth. I won't tell you what it said. That one is mine. I filed the folder. I labeled it clearly. I put it on the shelf. Then I did something I had been thinking about for weeks. I went to the corner of the basement, the place on the east wall behind the workbench where the brick used to be loose, where Victor had kept his secret for 39 years, and I pressed my hand flat against it, solid, sealed, nothing behind it. I had thought, when I first came back to the basement after everything, that I would feel something specific in this spot, anger maybe, or a kind of mournful recognition of all those years the secret had been sitting there in the dark while we'd been living above it. What I actually felt was something more ordinary and less clear than either of those. Just the wall, brick under my palm, old and solid and indifferent to everything that had happened around it. Things don't carry weight unless we give it to them. That's what I thought, standing there. The wall doesn't remember. The house doesn't remember. What remembers is the person who was inside the events, and what she chooses to do with the memory is the only story that actually matters. I had chosen to build an archive. I had chosen to call Dorothy every week and sometimes twice. I had chosen to plant the tulip bulbs in October, the week after I came back from the attorney's office, on a cold and slightly rainy afternoon when my hip was protesting every bend and I probably should have waited. I had put them in the ground anyway because they would come up in spring whether or not anything else was resolved, and I had wanted to see them. They came up in April, the week Victor died, pink and white and yellow, the same varieties I'd planted for 30 years, pushing up through the ground with the absolute indifference to human suffering that is both the most annoying and most consoling thing about gardens. I stood at the back window and looked at them for a long time. Adrian called on a Sunday morning 6 weeks later, not about anything in particular, no crisis, no agenda. He called and said he'd been clearing some things out of his apartment. He was living in an apartment now, the separation from Lila having concluded in the quiet administrative way that the ends of things often do, and he had found a box of photographs from when he was young. Did I want them? Yes, I said. Bring them. I could bring them this weekend if that's fine, I said. There was a pause. Then, how are you? And the thing about that question, asked by my son on a Sunday morning 6 weeks after his father died, is that I could hear in it the same quality I'd heard in Victor's voice in those basement afternoons. The attempt at honesty, the uncertainty of how to begin. Some days are better than others, I said. Today is a reasonable one. Yeah, he said. Same. Come Saturday, I said. I'll make the soup you used to like. The one with the white beans. A pause that had several things in it. Okay, he said finally. Yeah, that sounds... Yeah. He came on Saturday. He brought the photographs. He ate 2 bowls of soup and didn't say anything particularly profound, and neither did I. And we sat in the kitchen with the east window and talked about ordinary things. His work, my garden, a documentary series he'd been watching that he thought I might like. It was not a repaired relationship. It was not a concluded story. It was 2 people sitting in a kitchen eating soup and trying. That's not nothing. That might be everything, actually, depending on how you measure. Here's what I know now that I didn't know before any of this happened. I know that patience without a limit is not virtue. It's slow disappearance. I had spent 40 years absorbing things that deserved more than absorption, more than a bitten cheek and a made cup of coffee and a smile at the right moment. I had called that grace. It was in part, but it was also fear of conflict, of being difficult, of taking up more space than I'd been given. The basement taught me that you can run out of that kind of patience and find something else on the other side. Not anger, or not only anger, something clearer, a sense of your own shape, of the specific space you occupy in the world, and your right to occupy it without apology. I know that houses are not just property. The law reduces them to assets, to square footage, to title documents and deed transfers. But a house is also the east-facing kitchen window, and the third stair that groans, and the tulip beds, and the basement archive, and 40 years of ordinary Thursday evenings, and the particular sound of someone you love moving through rooms at night. You cannot deed transfer that. You cannot forge it, or assess it, or dissolve it into a family trust. I know that love, the real kind, not the performed version, does not arrive with conditions and clipboards and a plan for what to do with you when you've become inconvenient. And when someone arrives in your life with conditions and clipboards, no matter who they are, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is refuse to pretend otherwise. I know that Victor was not a perfect man, and I was not a perfect wife. And the 41 years between us were not a perfect marriage, and none of that matters in the way I thought it might. Perfection is a story people tell to avoid the difficulty of being real. What we had was real. It was sometimes hard and sometimes beautiful, and occasionally both at the same time, and it was ours, built by us, and no one could take it. Not even a son in a suit with a stack of papers and a plan. I know that 67 is not finished. I want to say that very clearly for anyone who needs to hear it. 67 with arthritic fingers and a bad hip and a garden and an archive and a Tuesday morning ahead of her is not finished. The world will try at various points to make you believe that age is diminishment, that the further you get from the beginning of your life, the less you are. It isn't true. You are simply further along. You know more. You have survived more. The things that haven't killed you have not made you simply stronger. They have made you more specifically yourself, more clear on what matters, less willing to waste what's left on things that don't. The basement taught me that I was still, underneath all the patience, still in there, Marianne. The woman who could go out a window in the cold and get herself to an attorney and come back in through the same window and sit calmly at a folding table and wait. She had always been in there. She had just been waiting for a good enough reason to come out. On the last day of April, 3 weeks after Victor passed, the tulips still going in the garden, I went down to the basement in the morning with my coffee and sat at the oak table. The east window, the archive on the shelves, the reading chair in the corner, empty now. I sat for a while, then I opened my notepad, the same kind I always kept, the same brand I'd had in my cardigan pocket that first terrible night, and I started writing. Not letters, not legal notes, not the planning and organizing that had kept me alive through the worst of it. Just the story, my story, from the beginning, from the night they walked in with their suits and their clipboard and their stack of papers all the way through. I wrote it the way it happened, without cleaning it up, without making myself better than I was, or Victor better than he was, or Adrian more simply villainous than he was. I wrote it as it had been, complicated and painful, and occasionally, in the basement light of a Wednesday afternoon, something approaching necessary. I wrote for 3 hours. When I stopped, my fingers ached and my coffee was cold, and the April light through the east window had moved from morning pale to midday clear. I capped my pen. I set the notepad on the table. I looked around the room, my archive, my space, my house, and I thought about what it had cost to be here, sitting in this chair, in this morning, with the story written down and the tulips outside and the third stair still groaning and the east window still east facing and everything exactly where it belonged. It had cost a great deal. It had been worth every bit of it. I picked up my coffee cup. I went upstairs. I rinsed the cup at the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the garden, and then I put on my shoes and my coat, and I went outside into the April morning, into my own yard, among my own tulips, and I stood in the light for a while, just stood there, strong and whole and completely my own.